The flush before plumbing. Han Dynasty toilet engineering. Imagine waking up in the bustling city of Chang'an, sometime around 100 BCE. You're a government clerk, living in a modest courtyard house. Before breakfast, there's a matter that must be handled first. And no, it's not paperwork. You shuffle quietly to the rear corner of the compound, where a humble wooden seat covers a rectangular stone-framed hole in the ground. Your private latrine dot in the grand sweep of Chinese history. It's easy to overlook the toilet. But during the Han Dynasty, roughly spanning from 206 BCE to 220 CE, the empire made significant strides in public and private sanitation. The Han didn't invent toilets, but they standardized and engineered them with remarkable thoughtfulness. For those who lived in cities like Chang'an or Luoyang, the early morning ritual of using the toilet was part of a larger system that included designated waste collectors, underground drainage channels, and in some cases, early attempts at odor control. Let's begin with the basic design. The most common latrine during the Han Dynasty was the pit latrine, typically a shallow rectangular trench dug into the earth, reinforced with brick or stone to prevent collapse. The latrine seat, if there was constructed from a sturdy slab of stone with a keyhole-shaped opening. For wealthier households, these seats were often smoothed and sometimes covered with wooden lids to ward off flies. The pit underneath was either left to compost slowly or, more commonly in cities, emptied regularly by sanitation workers, known as fen sheenite soil collectors. These latrines were often placed near the outer walls of homes or in alleys, connected by shallow channels to storm drains. While true underground sewage systems, like those in Rome, were rare in Han cities, the Chinese created a patchwork of drains and tunnels that carried excess rainwater and, when lucky, waste away from populous areas. One surprising element of Han toilet design was the use of water. In areas where fresh water was accessible, some affluent families designed toilets over small flowing streams, sometimes diverting spring water through the base of the toilet. While not a flush toilet in the modern sense, this method used the flow of water to carry waste away from the home, a marked step forward in both hygiene and convenience. Archaeological digs in the ancient palace at Zhongquanzi, a Han-era relay station along the Silk Road, revealed a primitive flush toilet system, a latrine seat placed over a deep trough with a duct system that may have channeled water beneath it. For the average citizen, however, things were more hands-on. The bamboo scrapers called chechu were used in place of toilet paper. These were flat sticks, often rinsed and reused, stored in jars of vinegar or hot water to sanitize them between uses. In more sophisticated setups, they might be stacked beside the toilet, alongside bowls of ash or scented herbs used to mask odors. The cold touch of a bamboo scraper in winter was surely unpleasant, but it was the standard method, long before the advent of soft, disposable tissue. City planners took public hygiene seriously, not out of benevolence, but for control and order. Filth was seen not only as a health risk, but as a social disruption. Bad smells and visible waste were reflections of poor governance. In fact, during the reign of Emperor Wu of Han, edicts were issued requiring large homes and businesses to construct latrines away from the main roads, to reduce unpleasant smells and ensure a cleaner cityscape. Public latrines were constructed in markets, rest stations, and official compounds. These were often shared by dozens, if not hundreds, of people in a day. To manage this, government officials created rotas for cleaning and signs in classical. Chinese warned of fines for those caught damaging the facilities or lingering too long. Some even believed that ghosts or spirits haunted the darker corners of latrines, encouraging users not to tarry. Perhaps most curious is the early form of inspection that officials carried out. Records from Han legal documents mention sanitation reviews of official buildings. Inspectors would note whether latrines were regularly emptied, whether odors were noticeable from the street, and whether any unclean implements were left in view. In bureaucratic reports, the condition of a building's latrine could even affect the clerk's performance review, though we don't know whether they ever received commendations for a well-scrubbed toilet. These small details, seemingly trivial, point to a larger truth about the Han. The state was deeply concerned with order, hierarchy, and the smooth running of society, even in matters as mundane as human waste. But this raises a question. How did such systems evolve across the vast rural countryside, where water was scarcer and resources thinner? In the broad expanse of the Han Dynasty's territory, city life was the exception, not the rule. While urban centers like Luoyang and Chang'an were models of imperial administration, the overwhelming majority of Han subjects lived in rural hamlets scattered across mountains, river valleys, and farmlands. And while toilets in the capital might feature stone seating, bamboo scrapers, and even water channels in the countryside, the situation was, let's say, more rustic. To understand how sanitation operated in the Han countryside, we must begin by accepting a key truth. Waste was not considered waste in the modern sense. For farmers, human excrement was a resource fertilizer with immense value. In fact, the collection and use of night soil, the fen, became a key component of Han agricultural success. Rather than flush it away, rural families carefully collected it, stored it, and applied it to their fields. This wasn't a sign of poverty, it was good land. Stewardship. Typical rural toilets were often little more than a wooden plank over a shallow pit located behind the home or on the edge of a field. The user would squat, often shielded by a reed screen or a low mud wall. In colder regions, wind protection was a priority. Some even built toilets partially underground, using dry thatch or animal hides as a form of insulation. In wealthier farms, simple roofing structures were erected to keep off the rain and offer a modicum of privacy. The collected night soil was stored in large earthenware jars or clay-lined pits. Over weeks or months, the material would decompose and ferment, quite literally curing, before being spread across fields. The smell, of course, was substantial. To combat this, rural households would often add straw, ash, or lime to the pits, helping both the composting process and odor control. In some regions, villagers used specific weeds or citrus peels believed to suppress unpleasant aromas. What's remarkable is how well this system worked. The reuse of waste in farming created a circular economy long before that term existed. The Han government recognized this and encouraged night soil collection in state-owned agricultural tracts. Imperial records mention the appointment of local compost overseers. Not glamorous work, but an official role nonetheless. But as practical as these systems were, they weren't without danger. Disease from improperly composted waste was a risk, particularly in densely populated regions. The Han didn't yet understand germ theory, but they did notice that poorly maintained latrines correlated with outbreaks of illness. This led to early public health advisories, framed in terms of Taoist balance and yin-yang harmony. If waste was left to rot in the wrong place, it was said to attract unclean spirits or cause imbalances in qi. Superstition and sanitation often went hand in hand. Rural communities were highly attuned to seasonal rhythms, and toilet habits followed the same logic. During summer months, when smells were strongest and disease most feared, families took extra care with their latrines. In winter, frozen waste might be stored until it could be properly dealt with come spring. Some villagers even believed that the position of their latrine on the property could influence family luck. A toilet built facing the wrong cardinal direction was said to drain fortune from the home. Gender roles, too, shaped how and where toilets were used. In many villages, Men and women did not share the same facilities. Female latrines were hidden deeper in the compound or separated by hedges. Girls were taught modesty in these matters from a young age. In some areas, women even used designated chamber pots indoors, emptying them discreetly after nightfall. These pots, often ceramic and decorated, served both practical and cultural purposes, signaling the line between household purity and the unclean outside world. As with all things in Han China, hierarchy mattered. Wealthy landlords had better latrines. Traveling officials could expect simple outhouses at provincial inns, but the poorest farmers, many simply used the edges of their fields. This practice, though frowned upon, was common. Edicts encouraged people to construct proper latrines, but enforcement was lax outside of city centers. After all, who would find a family of 5 barely surviving on millet and cabbage? Still, there were efforts to educate the population. The government issued agricultural manuals, many of which included short chapters on waste collection, fertilization, and even toilet building techniques. One well-known text, the Kimin Yaoshu, compiled just after the Han, but drawing from Han customs, offered a detailed account of how to compost safely and where, to locate toilets to harmonize with the energies of the home. And then there were the traveling doctors healers who moved from village to village, observing latrines and diagnosing ailments by inspecting the shape, smell, and texture of excrement. Their observations were compiled in medical treatises and passed down for generations. The Huangbi Neijing, though primarily a text on internal medicine, alludes to bowel movements as reflections of cosmic balance. A clean and well-kept latrine, it was said, helped preserve not only bodily health, but also household harmony. As sanitation norms began to spread outward from cities, a subtle transformation took place. Rural villages near trade routes, temples, or schools started adopting more structured latrine systems. Travelers shared new methods. Craftsmen who worked in city building projects brought back ideas about stone-seated toilets or water channels. A slow diffusion of toilet culture was underway. Still, one question lingered in the minds of Han reformers. How could they ensure that sanitation practices reached even the farthest corners of the empire, from border forts to mountain hamlets? By the 1st century CE, the Han Dynasty had firmly established itself as the dominant power in East Asia, with territories stretching from the Korean peninsula to the western deserts near modern-day Xinjiang. The empire's biggest challenge was not merely conquest, it was maintenance. Roads needed repairing, grain needed storing, officials needed salaries, and the people, from farmers to scholars, needed systems they could rely on. In this grand machinery of administration, toilets, yes, even toilets became part of statecraft. The Han approach to toilets was never just about comfort. It was about control. Let's begin in the barracks. In frontier garrisons like those stationed in the Gansu corridor, latrines were built with military precision. Dug into the frozen ground, reinforced with stone, and arranged in straight rows. These toilets served hundreds of soldiers daily. Sanitation was not optional. It was essential for health, morale, and discipline. Soldiers rotated duties cleaning the latrines, a task that doubled as punishment and hygiene enforcement. Military records from the Han even document latrine fatigue, an official duty assigned during disciplinary action. Offending troops could be tasked with waste removal from camp toilets or cleaning foul tools with vinegar under supervision. Officers took careful note of those who neglected these tasks. A dirty latrine, after all, could mean the start of an epidemic. An illness among troops was a threat far greater than most invading nomads thought in more settled provinces. Local magistrates were expected to maintain public health as a reflection of good governance. A neglected toilet in a government compound could tarnish a magistrate's reputation. Local tax collectors who noticed sewage in the streets or foul odors around the market might file complaints, triggering investigations. The Han bureaucracy prided itself on detail, even if those details included the cleanliness of communal IVIES, thought to assist the administration. Imperial workshops developed tools of the trade, ceramic waste pots, lime-based deodorizers, and even specialized brushes made of reed or stiff horsehair for cleaning latrine seats. Government contracts were issued to local artisans for the construction of toilet facilities at state-run inns, courier relay stations, and tax offices. These rest stops, spaced along key roads, offered the traveling scholar or courier a chance to eat, sleep, and relieve himself in facilities that were, if not luxurious, at least standardized. But as Han society grew more sophisticated, so too did its anxieties. One of the greatest fears in elite Han culture was moral decay. A family might appear wealthy, but if its servants failed to clean the latrines, or if household waste was seen near the street, neighbors might whisper of internal disorder. Dirty toilets were interpreted not only as unhygienic, but as a symptom of moral failure. Some Confucian thinkers even argued that a man who could not manage his privy should not be trusted with managing people. This attitude extended to education. In the more progressive cities, boys were taught from an early age not only to write and recite classical texts, but to understand household management, including the construction and care of the family toilet. Girls, likewise, were instructed in modesty and cleanliness. Manuals for young brides often included short chapters on when and how to clean the latrine, and which days of the lunar calendar were most auspicious for doing so. The imperial court took things even further. Empress Lu, known for her keen interest in public order, is recorded in later chronicles as having commissioned a special waste disposal unit for the palace constructed of stone, with 2 chambers and a system of sluices to manage odors. While the full details are unclear, archaeological digs in the region have uncovered latrine chambers in elite compounds, with clear signs of engineered water channels and even small flush holes likely used for pouring water down. One of the more fascinating evolutions of this system occurred in the imperial archives. Documents detailing the management of waste, when collected, by whom, how it was disposed, were meticulously recorded. Officials reported monthly waste tallies. Some cities even weighed and taxed collected night soil, especially in the eastern granary towns, where manure was highly sought after for wheat and rice farming. But this obsession with order had unintended consequences. As the central government grew more involved in everyday affairs, including where people relieved themselves, it also grew more vulnerable. Critics emerged. Poets and philosophers began satirizing the state's fixation on control. One satirical verse from the Book of Satirical Songs reads, "He governs the scrolls, he governs the schools, now he governs the stink of our stools." Whether the poem was widely read is unknown, but the sentiment echoed through the later years of the Han, when cracks in imperial authority began to appear. Overregulation, even of toilets, became a symbol of overreach. Yet the sanitation infrastructure endured, even after the fall of the Eastern Han in 220 CE. Many of its systems, both practical and administrative, were absorbed into successor states. So what did we learn from this seemingly mundane tale of pit latrines, bamboo scrapers, and imperial waste management? We learned that sanitation is CIVILISATION. In a world without modern plumbing, every flush-like invention, every standardized seat, every written rule about waste disposal was a step toward public health, urban order, and social dignity. The Han Dynasty didn't invent the toilet, but they made it a matter of national policy. And that policy, oddly quiet, unremarkably humble, became a foundation on which cities could thrive. The next time you walk into a clean bathroom with running water and good lighting, spare a thought for the civil servants of Han China. who believed that how you managed your waste said everything about how you managed your life. But here's the question to carry forward. If the Han could engineer a sanitation system for millions with clay, vinegar, and reed brushes, why do some modern cities still struggle to keep their public toilets clean? Night soil collectors of ancient China. The city's quietest workforce is just before dawn in Luoyang, one of the great capitals of the Han Dynasty. The streets are silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the scrape of a sandaled foot on stone. The markets are shuttered, the scholars still dreaming, and even the city watch has dozed off. But in the winding alleys between homes, shadowy figures move with purpose. They carry yokes across their shoulders, balancing sloshing wooden buckets at either end. Their hands are calloused. Their sandals are stained. Their noses have long since given up resisting. These are the Fen Shi, the night soil men. Though rarely mentioned in the grand chronicles of the Han court, these workers were essential to the function of the empire's cities. Every home with a latrine, every market with a public toilet relied on them. They were the first link in the sanitation chain, collecting human waste and transporting it beyond the city walls to be processed, sold, or buried. Their work was silent, routine, and utterly essential. It was, quite literally, the dirty work of empire. The term night soil refers to the human waste collected overnight in pots, privy vaults, and pit toilets. The night soil collectors usually began their routes around the third watch of the night, roughly 1 a.m., and continued until the streets began to stir with morning life. Their buckets made of thick wood, bound with iron hoops, were designed to contain both liquid and solid waste. A full night's haul might weigh over 40 kilograms, sloshing ominously with each careful step. The role of Fen Shi was often hereditary or caste-based. In many cities, certain families were designated to manage waste collection, generation after generation. It wasn't just a job. It was a social identity. These men were considered part of the mean people, Jianmen, a category that included entertainers, butchers, gravediggers, and executioners. They lived on the margins, both physically and socially, yet their work was indispensable. Pay varied widely depending on region and demand. In wealthier districts, landlords might pay a monthly fee for collection, with some offering bonuses during the hot summer months when the smell was especially intense. In poorer districts, the Fen Shi might negotiate with farmers directly, selling the night soil by volume for use as fertilizer. A clever collector could maintain multiple routes, earning both wages and trade goods, vegetables, eggs, and occasionally rice in exchange for his cargo. In one famous case, the governor of Runan Prefecture was demoted after his district was found to have public privies with stagnant pits and unchecked effluents into the street ditches. His replacement, more diligent, if less refined, ordered weekly cleanings and even hosted a short ceremony to thank the Fen Shi for their service to the flow of state harmony. What did the people think of all this? For the wealthy, these policies meant their servants received proper tools and schedules for waste disposal. For the poor, it often meant stricter enforcement fines for open defecation, for unregistered compost pits, or for blocking drainage channels. In some cities, communal toilets were built in response to imperial pressure, offering free use during daylight hours. But in others, resentment grew. Still, many farmers benefited. With a more reliable system for compost distribution, crop yields improved. Waste was delivered on schedule, lessening the burden of collecting it themselves. Regional governors began tracking compost flows on bamboo records data that, centuries later, would offer modern historians insight into Han agricultural cycles. By 100 BCE, Emperor Wu's waste reforms had taken root across much of the core Han territory. From dusty border towns to bustling capitals, the systems put in place helped prevent disease, improve food production, and demonstrated the incredible reach of centralized bureaucracy. Yet, despite this success, questions remained. How long could such a tightly controlled system endure without the emperor's obsessive oversight? And what happened when the state's gaze shifted elsewhere? By the early years of the 1st century BCE, the effects of Emperor Wu's sanitation reforms were being felt across the empire. Cities like Luoyang, Chang'an, and Nanyang saw marked improvements in cleanliness, crop production, and general urban order. Civil servants now routinely included latrine inspection and waste tallying in their monthly duties. And yet, while the system appeared stable from the capital's vantage point, its spread across the empire revealed cracks in both ideology and implementation. The empire was simply too big, from the humid rice paddies of the south to the cold steppe. Outposts in the far west, provincial officials struggled to implement the central mandates. The Waste Control Directive, brilliant in principle, had been written with city life in mind. It assumed access to water for drainage, enough population density to justify frequent collection, and surplus labor to enforce rules. None of these could be taken for granted in the outer provinces. Take the province of Shu, modern-day Sichuan, for instance. Known for its mountain ranges and deep valleys, Shu was geographically isolated and culturally distinct. Waste monitors here faced a unique problem: elevation. Many homes and public buildings were built on slopes, where digging pit toilets posed logistical challenges. A standardized privy plan simply didn't work. So local officials improvised, constructing hanging toilets on wooden balconies. Wooden seats placed over narrow chutes that emptied waste into sealed pots below. These pots had to be manually carried, often up or down steep paths to composting sites. The risk of spills was high, and accidents were common. In the far northwest, in the Gansu corridor near Dunhuang, the arid climate brought another challenge: water scarcity. With little water to aid in waste removal or control odors, dry composting became the norm. Households used ash, sand, and sometimes even camel hair to cover waste in pits. These latrines were well ventilated but required constant maintenance. Provincial waste monitors had to adapt Emperor Wu's edicts into practical guidelines, often relying on local Taoist almanacs and folk knowledge to establish sanitary norms. Even more challenging was the ideological resistance. In many frontier zones, tribal communities viewed latrine use as unnatural. Nomadic cultures, such as the Jiangnu and certain Kong groups, preferred open fields or portable chamber pots. Attempts to introduce Han-style waste systems were met with confusion or disdain. Some Han settlers in these regions complied with sanitation edicts out of fear of fines, but many ignored them entirely. Local officials, stretched thin, rarely enforced the laws with consistency. There were also political tensions. Some governors saw the waste reforms as a symbol of imperial micromanagement, rather than focusing on military defense or famine relief. They were expected to report on privy dimensions and pit conditions. One official in the province of Yu, facing flooding and food shortages, famously scribbled in a letter to the capital, "Shall the first repair the riverbanks or empty the chamber?" Pots? Even in more compliant regions, bureaucratic inertia slowed progress. Tools were delayed. Instructions arrived late or were mistranslated. Bamboo slips detailing compost quotas might be lost in transit or misfiled in storage. A single missed delivery could mean no fertilizer for spring planting. And then came corruption. As always in large systems, some officials exploited their posts. Waste monitors began charging bribes for favorable reports. Some turned a blind eye to illegal dumping in exchange for gifts or grain. Others exaggerated compost tallies to earn praise from superiors. In Nanyang, an audit uncovered that a single model district had reported more waste collection than its population could feasibly produce, suggesting either fraud or the world's most prodigious eaters. The court responded with reorganization. In 95 BCE, the Waste Control Directive was amended to include rotating appointments. Monitors were moved between regions to prevent local collusion. Additional inspectors, known as Luguan, pathway watchers, were assigned to walk major thoroughfares and assess sanitation by smell and sight. Despite these efforts, by the final decade of Emperor Wu's reign, enthusiasm for the reforms began to wane. The emperor, aging and increasingly isolated, was more concerned with succession and foreign wars. The court grew distracted. Sanitation budgets were cut. Inspectors went unpaid. Bamboo tally slips lay uncollected in district offices. Yet something curious had happened. The people, in many cities, had internalized the system. Farmers who had benefited from reliable compost continued collecting waste, even without government. Prompting. Guilds of waste collectors, once tied to official schedules, began organizing themselves informally. Some even drafted their own agreements, simple written contracts recording volumes, routes, and payment in kind. In cities like Changsha and Handan, night soil trade became semi-priv ATICD. One letter recovered from a rubbish pit in Changsha, written by a merchant to his son, captures this evolution. The city men no longer wait for orders from Liu Yang. They sell their own waste, twice a moon. A full cart fetches 2 hens and a jug of rice wine. The farmers come early, eager for the good stuff. Our neighbors have dug a second pit to meet demand. Tell your uncle it is time we built one too. The waste economy had taken on a life of its own, and yet, without the state's guiding hand, disparities grew. Wealthy districts kept their systems running smoothly. Poorer areas suffered. Latrines collapsed, waste overflowed, illnesses returned. Some cities tried to enforce order with local patrols or fines, but lacked the reach and resources of the imperial system. Thus, a curious paradox emerged. Emperor Wu's reforms, born of centralized ambition, succeeded best when they inspired decentralized action. By trying to regulate even the smallest details of daily life, he had created a cultural norm that outlasted the edict itself. But as the emperor's final years drew near, the question loomed, could such an ordinary achievement waste removal become part of his imperial legacy? Or would history forget the clean streets and full compost jars that helped keep his empire fed? In the twilight of Emperor Wu's long reign, the court was consumed with omens. Comets appeared in the sky. Earthquakes shook remote prefectures. Rumors swirled that heaven was displeased. The aging emperor, once called the martial sovereign for his territorial conquests, turned introspective. He issued edicts of repentance. He ordered temples built, sacrifices made. He began to withdraw. No one, it seems, spoke of waste collection anymore. The great sanitation initiative that had spread across the Han heartland measured, monitored, taxed, and tallied had done its work too quietly. There were no monuments to commemorate the Sigi Wan who oversaw latrines, no poems to praise the farmers who composted with discipline. It was not the kind of reform that inspired grand epics or temple carvings. It simply worked. And that may have been its greatest strength. As the empire edged toward the 1st century CE. It did so on foundations made not only of stone and scrolls, but of well-managed privies, predictable compost, and public health. Modern historians have begun to see the waste reforms as an invisible thread running through the golden age of Han stability. Where cities remained orderly, sanitation had played its role. Where food supplies were strong, compost had quietly enriched the soil. Even in the court's own records, there are subtle acknowledgments of the impact. One tax ledger from the city of Yuyang shows a curious entry. Exemptions granted to 5 composting households for exceptional yield. Another document from a magistrate in Qi praises a local Fenshi collective for maintaining odorless and orderly streets through 4 seasons. Such fragments, once ignored, now whisper of a reform whose value exceeded its recognition. But what of the emperor himself? In the grand tomb of Emperor Wu at Meiling, a vast mausoleum said to rival the pyramids in scale inscriptions list his many accomplishments. They speak of conquered kingdoms, instituted rituals, and Confucian policies. There is no mention of waste, no plaque for sanitation. And perhaps that is fitting. The emperor did not pursue the waste control directive for glory. He did it because, at the height of his administrative clarity, he understood a timeless truth. The measure of a ruler is not in how he handles victory, but in how he manages the mundane dot. What is governance, after all, if not the patient organization of thousands of small details? The width of a latrine trench, the timing of a compost cycle, the placement of a bucket along a city street. These were the details that kept people healthy, kept streets passable, and fields fertile. They did not shape dynasties in fire and gold, but they allowed dynasties to endure, and endure they did for a time. The waste reforms, even without their founders' attention, continued in various forms under later rulers. By the Eastern Han, local governments managed sanitation as part of routine city maintenance. The original blueprints for privy construction became reference tools in civil engineering. Some even argue that the waste quotas recorded meticulously during Emperor Wu's reign influenced later agricultural tax assessments, tying compost to coin. Centuries later, during the Song Dynasty, a scholar named Su Song referenced an ancient emperor who tamed the streets through the quiet logic of the privy. He did not name Emperor Wu directly, but he understood the weight of humble order. In modern archaeology, traces of this legacy still emerge. Excavated Han toilets show consistent dimensions across vast regions. Waste pits match imperial specifications. Even the buckets rarely preserved show similar volumes, as though shaped by a single standard. And so, while emperors are often remembered for war, religion, or reform, Wu's legacy includes something far more elemental. He made toilets, part of statecraft. In a world still struggling with sanitation crises today, that decision made over 2,000 years ago feels oddly modern. As we close this chapter, a simple question lingers, quietly relevant even now. If an emperor could measure the health of a nation in its latrines, why do so many leaders today overlook the infrastructure beneath their feet? Story 4. Toilet tokens, pit latrines, and privy etiquette in early Chinese households. You're visiting a middle-class household in Han Dynasty China. It's late evening. The courtyard is quiet. The scent of steamed millet still lingers in the air. In the far corner of the property, a covered wooden structure stands apart from the sleeping chambers. Inside, a flat stone slab with an oval hole sits atop a brick-lined pit. This is the family latrine. But before you use it, a few things must be understood. Using the toilet in early Chinese homes wasn't a private act in the modern sense. It was ritualized, regulated, and tied to social norms passed down through generations. From architecture to etiquette, the Han household privy was a microcosm of order, shaped by beliefs about health, hierarchy, and even the supernatural. Let's begin with the layout. For wealthier homes, those belonging to merchants, scholars, or mid-ranking officials, the latrine was often located in the rear court, away from the main hall, but within the protective walls of the home. Built with timber posts and thatched or tiled roofing, the structure was modest but clean. A narrow drainage channel often led away from the pit, guiding waste toward the compost area or a nearby ditch. Ash or lime was sprinkled after each use to reduce odor and assist decomposition. Toilet seats themselves varied by region. In northern areas, where winters were harsh, seats were often made of wood or smooth stone. sometimes with lids to retain heat. In southern provinces, a simple, all-over a pit sufficed. For elite households, padded seats or silk-wrapped cushions were reserved for the elderly or infirm, an early example of hygienic comfort, and a status symbol. But no one simply walked in and used the toilet. In Han households, toilet access, especially in large families, was often managed with tokens. Small wooden plaques or carved stones, kept in a jar near the entryway, served as a sign of permission. A family member would take the token when using the privy and return it afterward. This wasn't just about fairness. It helped avoid embarrassment, ensured privacy in shared spaces, and prevented younger children from wandering into unsanitary conditions. In wealthier homes, servants kept a log of usage, noting when ash or herbal deodorants needed replenishing. Children were trained early. From around age 4 or 5, boys and girls were taught the proper method of squatting, how to clean themselves with bamboo scrapers, and how to dispose of scraps and wiping cloths. Parents used rhymes and songs to reinforce these lessons, often blending them with ideas of balance and harmony. One popular rhyme went, "North wind in winter, squat low and tight. Bamboo cool, but quick and right. Sprinkle ash, bow your head. Clean hands before the night is shed." Cleanliness was tied to morality. A child who left the seat unclean or spilled water near the door might be scolded not just for mess, but for disrespecting the ancestors. Many households placed small spirit tablets or paper charms near the latrine, invoking protection from ghosts believed to dwell in unclean places. Taoist guides warned of gooey wandering spirits who thrived on human filth. To defile the privy was to invite misfortune. Women's toilet use had its own protocols. Modesty was paramount. Female family members often used the latrine at designated times, especially in the early morning or after meals, to avoid being seen. In extended households, mothers-in-law used the facilities first, followed by daughters-in-law, then younger girls. In larger compounds, separate toilet stalls were sometimes built for men and women, with cloth partitions and different deodorizing herbs used mugwort for women, wormwood for men. Nighttime use presented special challenges, while chamber pots were common. They weren't always ideal. A full pot had to be emptied by dawn, often by a servant or junior family member. Some homes designated a rotating schedule called the Dengui to manage these duties. Quiet, discretion, and careful. Balancing were expected. Spilling the contents could result in days of shame, especially if it occurred near sleeping quarters. In colder months, warming the seat with heated stones or wrapping it in thick cloth was an act of care, especially for elders. Children were taught to offer the warm seat to grandparents first, a small gesture that reinforced filial piety. Yet, as structured as the system was, humor still had its place. Latrine jokes and folk riddles were common. In rural areas, traveling storytellers often included comedic toilet tales in their routines. Light jabs at greedy officials or forgetful scholars who mistook the ash jar for the vinegar pot. These tales reminded listeners that even the mighty must squat, and that no one emperor or farmer was above the call of nature. Interestingly, toilet etiquette was also tied to hospitality. Visitors staying overnight were quietly informed of the privy's location and offered fresh bamboo scrapers or cloth wipes in decorative holders. Failing to provide these was considered rude. In high-class homes, hosts even placed incense near the latrine and laid down clean straw mats. A respected guest might later mention the cleanliness of his host's toilet in a letter or poem. A tome. Subtle nod to household virtue. To maintain all this, daily labor was required. Servants scrubbed seats with vinegar, emptied pits when full, and replaced cloth partitions. Compost was managed with tools handed down across generations. Some families even had special prayer days dedicated to King Fushen, a minor household god believed to ward off illness from unsanitary corners. All of this tokens, rhymes, incense, etiquette makes clear one thing. The toilet was not a forgotten corner of Han domestic life. It was a space of ritual, order, and meaning. But this raises a question. When the empire's center faltered and homes fell into disrepair, did this domestic sanitation culture survive? Or were these daily rituals swept away in the broader currents of history? The Han Dynasty, for all its grandeur and governance, was not eternal. As political infighting deepened and the once efficient bureaucracy grew bloated, cracks formed in every corner of society, including, unsurprisingly, the household latrine. And yet, even as imperial power faltered in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the domestic rituals of sanitation quietly persisted. Why? Because they were no longer just state-imposed norms. They had become part of everyday culture. Let us begin with the countryside. Even in the most modest mud brick homes of farmers and artisans, the lessons passed down in the Han period lingered. The toilet remained a structured space. Tokens, while sometimes replaced with simpler pebbles, old wooden tags were still used to manage turn-taking and ensure cleanliness. The bamboo scraper retained its place beside clay bowls of water or vinegar, and ash so abundant in homes heated by wood. Fires continued to be the default deodorizer and compost starter. Families knew that a clean toilet meant fewer flies, fewer stomach complaints, and less shame when guests visited. Even in times of famine or war, when food and tools were scarce, pit latrines were maintained, covered, and reinforced with straw or rock to prevent collapse. In wealthier rural households, the latrine was treated with as much planning as the kitchen. Some even positioned toilets to align with auspicious directions based on geomantic readings. One farmer's almanac from the late Han period warns, "A pit opened on an unlucky day invites both pests and misfortune. Let the stars guide your shovel." The connection between toilets and harmony was spiritual as well as practical. Taoist beliefs, already popular during the late Han, spread further during the empire's fragmentation. The toilet became a site of both purification and potential contamination. Taoist manuals advise burning dried mugwort in the latrine monthly to dispel yin energy. Householders performed small hand gestures, akin to blessings, before emptying chamber pots, especially at night. These rituals, while minor, reflected a worldview in which health, fate, and daily chores were deeply intertwined. This mindset proved remarkably durable. During the Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280 CE, cities crumbled, governments changed hands, but household hygiene continued to follow Han precedents. Families displaced by conflict often rebuilt toilets first, alongside cooking hearths and ancestor shrines. Letters recovered from frontier towns show requests for lime, vinegar, and straw essentials not just for food, but for managing waste. In the southern state of Wu, during this time, we see references to toilet building and settlement plans. The scholar official Zhang Bio, writing to his cousin in exile, advises, "Wherever you settle, dig first the well, then the privy. A roof may wait, but waste does not." That line, "waste does not wait," was quietly prophetic. Even as central governance broke down, the logic of sanitation endured. It was decentralized, self-managed, rooted not in imperial command but in lived experience. Households that kept clean toilets were less likely to suffer dysentery. Fields fertilized with well-composted waste yielded more grain. The results were visible, repeatable, and thus remembered. But not all was continuity. In war-torn areas, latrines fell into disuse. Chamber pots became the norm, emptied hastily in alleys or near water sources. Disease increased. In some besieged cities, waste piled in corners of once regulated compounds. People fled without tokens or scrapers. The toilet, once a symbol of order, became a sign of collapse. This prompted improvisation. In refugee settlements and makeshift villages, communal toilets were dug and shared among unrelated families. These lacked privacy, but were often kept with care. Responsibility rotated. Children were assigned ash-sprinkling duties. Elders reminded others to follow old rhymes, which by now had taken on a nostalgic tone. One seat for peace, two hands to clean. Where waste is hidden, the spirit stays serene. By the time the Jin Dynasty rose in the 4th century, much of the old Han court culture had faded, but the domestic toilet remained oddly stable. Archaeological evidence shows continued use of standard pit latrines, even as architecture and writing style shifted. Why? Perhaps because even when emperors fall and libraries burn, the body remains. Its rhythms do not change. And the habits built around those rhythms: tokens, ash, bamboo scrapers, morning visits to the rear corner of the home, are some of the oldest and most unshakable of all. Still, as new beliefs and technologies emerged, the latrine began to evolve. Some households experimented with waste-diverting systems, separating liquid from solid. Others began building more elaborate roofs, doors, or scented screens. Comfort joined cleanliness as a goal, and so we are left to wonder what remained unchanged. Amid all this change, what traditions of toilet etiquette, born in the Han, would survive the next millennium, and what new innovations would emerge to replace them? As centuries turned and dynasties rose and fell, the humble Chinese latrine quietly endured. While palaces crumbled and capitals shifted, the essential routines of sanitation carried on, rooted in tradition, shaped by survival, and slowly refined by the long passage of time. By the early medieval period, some elements of Han-era toilet etiquette had become so deeply embedded in household life that they no longer felt like customs. They were just the way things were done. In the southern dynasties, where Taoism gained further spiritual authority, the toilet became a liminal space, half mundane, half sacred. Taoist priests advised placing talismans above the privy door to ward off illness, or reciting short incantations to protect against spirits drawn to bodily functions. The belief persisted that certain unclean entities lingered near waste, and that cleanliness in the latrine protected the soul as well as the body. Meanwhile, technological changes continued at a glacial but meaningful pace. Some larger homes, particularly in urban areas of the southern dynasties, 420 to 589 CE, began installing water channels beneath their latrines, crude precursors to modern flush systems. These diverted small amounts of gray water from kitchens or courtyards, keeping pits from drying out and aiding in compost mixing. A few archaeological sites near Jiankang, modern Nanjing, show evidence of semi-enclosed privies with carved stone seating and patterned floor tiles, suggesting not just function, but comfort. The bamboo scraper remained a fixture, but more affluent households began wrapping their handles in silk or binding them with ribbon. Wealthier families even had custom holders, often small ceramic jars painted with poems, aphorisms, or seasonal flowers. It was a delicate contradiction. Art wrapped around utility, beauty hiding what was meant to be unseen. Etiquette manuals from this period also show the continued importance of toilet customs and family upbringing. The Jia Zun, Household Instructions, a widely read collection of moral advice, advises fathers to train sons in small matters, for great matters begin in habit. Let him sweep the privy before reading the classics. Here, the message was clear. Discipline in daily chores, including toilet use, reflected readiness for broader responsibility. Interestingly, latrine behavior also became a marker of refinement. In upper-class circles, Conversation about household order often included subtle references to the toilet. A gentleman's latrine was expected to be dry, discreetly screened, and free of foul odor. A poorly kept toilet was interpreted not just as laziness, but as evidence of moral laxity. Guests might never mention it aloud, but impressions were made the moment the door creaked open. Women, especially in scholar households, developed their own rituals. Embroidered cloths were placed beside chamber pots. Morning routines were coordinated. To avoid overlap, one anecdote from a Tang-era family record recounts a bride impressing her mother-in-law by discreetly burning citrus peels in the latrine each morning. Such actions were read as signs of grace, consideration, and moral purity. Yet, in peasant villages, the picture was simpler, though no less structured. Families dug their pits carefully, lined them with straw, and covered them between uses. Children continued to be trained with rhymes and rules. Ash was replaced only by what was available, often dry earth or crushed reeds, but the routine remained the same. In many regions, the latrine was still the first structure rebuilt after storms or raids. Its presence meant order had returned. And what of the tokens? Though less common in later centuries, the idea of taking a symbol before using the toilet survived in pockets of rural culture. In some areas, a painted stone was left near the latrine door, a subtle sign that the space was occupied. In others, a carved wooden figure was passed between family members, its worn edges telling the story of generations. As cities grew and public toilets appeared, especially under the Tang and Song dynasties, a new form of etiquette emerged: communal manners. Users were expected to clean the seat for the next person, avoid excessive noise, and if possible, bring their own scraper or cloth. Signs posted in some public latrines reminded visitors of their duties. Leave no trace, bring no ill fortune. And yet, the deepest legacy of Han privy culture wasn't material. It was psychological. From the use of tokens to the lighting of incense, Han households had taught generations to see the latrine not just as a necessity, but as a reflection of order. To manage waste carefully was to be civilized. To respect the toilet's rules was to live in harmony with the household and cosmos. This perspective filtered through dynasties, resurfacing in Confucian codes, Taoist rituals, and even legal records. In time, many of these practices fade and supplanted by new technologies, urban planning, and shifts in belief. Yet echoes remain. Even today, in parts of rural East Asia, you can find old pit latrines lined with ash, scrapers set in jars, and families who still remember the rhyme about the bamboo being cold but quick. The rhythm of daily life silent, repetitive, foundational carries the imprint of a world that once measured virtue by the cleanliness of a backyard toilet. But perhaps most moving are the human elements preserved in these layers. Tooth fragments, baby teeth, strands of hair, beads from children's bracelets, all recovered from ancient latrines. These are not just the detritus of bodies, but of stories. In some cases, the remains were found alongside traces of plant-based purgatives, senna leaves, wormwood, fermented plum rind, indicating a child suffering from stomach illness, perhaps cared for with herbal remedies, perhaps buried. Later nearby. Such details give us not grandeur, but closeness. In studying waste, archaeologists recover not the mythologized Han dynasty of scrolls and emperors, but the lived reality: anxious mothers, coughing soldiers, hungry children. A scrap of cloth, used and discarded, can tell as much about love and labor as any court record. The archaeological record also reveals regional differences in sanitation behavior. In the warm South, plantain leaves were used more frequently than bamboo sticks. In colder northwestern towns, dried river moss was found layered near toilet pits, used perhaps as soft padding or wiping material. In arid western garrisons, sand and fine ash formed layers between waste deposits. An effective early method of managing odor and accelerating decomposition. 1. Particularly well preserved. Latrine in Luoyang included a surprise: fragments of tiny lacquered spoons and chopsticks, perhaps lost during a meal, perhaps tossed by children playing nearby, or perhaps washed into the pit by mistake. There's no way to know for sure, but each find offers a new angle, a new glimpse into how closely the rhythms of food and filth were intertwined. That we often think of ancient history as distant, abstract temples, battles, dynasties. But here, in the muted layers of ancient waste, the past becomes personal. You can picture a scholar squatting quietly, murmuring lines of poetry to himself, bamboo scraper in hand. You can imagine a child peeking nervously into the pit, holding a wiping cloth, being taught by a patient grandmother. You can sense the quiet rituals of early morning. Draw water, light a lamp, step carefully onto the stone seat, add a handful of ash, bow your head. Archaeology has its limits. We cannot know what jokes were told in the silence of the privy. We cannot hear the small songs of etiquette, or feel the warmth of incense left burning by a daughter in honor of her elders. But sometimes the waste speaks clearly enough. And what it says is this: civilization is not built on conquest alone. It is built brick by brick on the quiet care of daily life. But this raises another question. If we can learn so much from hand sewage, what does it mean that we so often choose to ignore our own? As we reach the final layers of these ancient privies, brushes slow, fingers gloved, tools laid aside for careful documentation, we are left not only with data, but with questions. What does waste, preserved over millennia, truly reveal about civilization? What did the Han Dynasty leave behind, not in temples or tombs, but in the silent sediment of its everyday lives? In many ways, the answers are more profound than they. First appeared in a sealed latrine pit beneath a former Han relay station near modern-day Dunhuang. Archaeologists found layer upon layer of compacted matter, each stratum a moment in time. Over a decade of use was preserved here, with subtle shifts in texture, color, and content. The earliest layers were rough, thick with ash, animal hair, and coarse vegetable remnants. Over time, the layers became finer, indicating changes in diet, available goods, and perhaps even improved composting techniques. What stands out most, however, is not the waste itself, but its organization. Every few layers, a new material appears, usually a covering of straw or thatch, sometimes burnt, sometimes fresh. This wasn't accidental. It was care, a rhythm, a domestic protocol. Every week, perhaps, someone laid fresh straw, sprinkled ash, adjusted the drainage channel, stirred the compost. It's easy to imagine them, the quiet caretaker, kneeling in the cool air of morning or evening, tending to the latrine with the same attentiveness a scholar might bring to an inkstone. Not because it was glorious work, but because it mattered. This is where archaeology collides with philosophy. In the Confucian world, harmony begins at home. In Taoist thought, order arises from attending to the smallest flows of nature. And in these latrines, those principles took tangible form. To manage waste was to respect the rhythms of life. To care for the compost was to honor the body, the land, and the people who shared it. Some of the most surprising evidence for this ethos lies in Han burial customs. As mentioned earlier, chamber pots were often buried with the deceased. But so were scoops, ash jars, and even latrine diagrams. A noblewoman's tomb near Chengdu included a painted lacquer box with illustrations of daily chores among them. Toilet cleaning. This was not meant to shame. It was a portrait of dignity, the kind earned in routines, not rituals. Moreover, waste archaeology reveals a story of quiet innovation. where imperial records boast of military victories and diplomatic treaties. The privies show us adaptation, of using water channels to rinse waste, of crafting purpose-built scraper jars, of lining toilet pits with waterproof clay. These are not inventions that win empires, but they sustain them. They are the invisible technologies that hold cities together. The same principle echoes across time. Even now, in modern cities, the health of a population is still measured in part by the quality of its waste management. Sewage systems public, toilets, composting programs, these are not symbols of decay, but of progress. And yet, they often go unnoticed until they fail. Only when the pipes back up or the water runs foul do we remember how fragile civilization can be. This, perhaps, is the final lesson buried in Han latrines. We live in a world obsessed with visibility leaders on podiums, slogans on screens, symbols of wealth and power. But history reminds us, the foundations of order are usually invisible. A clean latrine, a compost pile turned on time, a scraper rinsed and returned to its jar. These details matter not because they dazzle, but because they endure. When archaeologists return to a site centuries from now, they may not care much for our tablets or tweets. They'll look at our waste, the materials we used, the food we consumed, the systems we built to carry it all away. And from that, they'll reconstruct our values, our daily routines, our unspoken priorities. Just as we do now with the Han. So the next time you step into a restroom, modern, clean, brightly lit, remember the long, unbroken line of human care that led to it. From pit latrines behind Han homes to the flush toilets of today, the story continues. And perhaps ask yourself, gently and with a small smile, what story will my waste tell 2,000 years from now? Story 6. How Silk Road traders used portable toilets on long caravan routes. Imagine a toilets on the vast caravan winding its way along the Silk Road long before it was called that, across endless plains of dust and rock. The year is roughly 80 BCE. Traders from Luoyang are on the move, carrying bolts of silk, medicinal herbs, lacquerware, and scrolls. The camels groan under their loads. The guards ride with alert eyes, and tucked quietly among the crates and bundles is something rarely mentioned in travelogues. The portable toilet, it wasn't much to look at, just a box, really. Square, wood-framed, with a circular lid. But for a weary traveler far from the comforts of a Han household latrine, it represented something more than convenience. It was a fragile bit of order in a journey filled with hardship. A pause in the harsh rhythm of desert travel. A chance to maintain dignity in the dust. Historians long assumed ancient caravan routes were rough. Improvisational affairs, sleeping on mats, relieving oneself behind dunes, and moving on. But recent discoveries in desert outposts and silk road relay stations suggest something more structured. Even in transit, hygiene mattered. One of the most revealing finds came from the site of Meran, an early oasis town along the southern Taklamakan Desert. Excavations unearthed fragments of a wooden toilet seat, smoothly carved, designed to rest atop a box or a shallow trench. Nearby were ceramic pots with sealed lids, still holding remnants of compacted waste. The pots were designed to be emptied. Later, possibly, it stops with composting pits or shallow latrines. In Jiwankwanzi, a postal station west of Dunhuang, archaeologists found storage compartments beneath sleeping platforms in caravanserai guest rooms. Inside, some were lidded containers, once filled with ash or sand-absorbent material, likely used in portable toilets. Instructions found on wooden slips even reference the need to empty travel jars before the second moonrise, suggesting a fixed routine for waste disposal. These early travel toilets came in several forms. The most common was the sealed waste pot, kept in a wooden chest with padded lining. Traders added ash after use and sealed the pot with wax or resin-soaked fabric. More sophisticated designs included a collapsible frame that could be placed over a shallow trench dug at night camps. When finished, the trench was filled, covered, and marked with a small can to discourage disturbance by animals or people. So why go through the trouble? Hygiene, certainly, but also ritual, habit, and even diplomacy. Many of these traders were minor officials, envoys, or scholarly scribes sent west with letters and gifts. Maintaining one's body, including sanitation, was part of their training. The Xinglu Shua Han-era travel manual advised, "Let your clothes be tidy, your bedding dry, and your privy jar empty before sunrise." To fail at these basics was seen as uncivilized. For women on the road, wives of merchants or daughters of diplomats, privacy and sanitation were even more important. Letters found in a merchant's archive near Lalon mention the small red tent, a collapsible screen carried specifically for toilet use. Inside, a chamber pot or waste bucket was placed, along with cloths, washing jars, and sometimes incense to mask odor. Modesty demanded these measures. So did safety. But it wasn't only about the travelers. Campsites along the Silk Road became small, self-contained systems. Waste was managed carefully, often dumped in designated pits outside the camp, downwind. Ash from cooking fires was used to cover latrines, and teams assigned cleanup duties rotated by day of the week. In some merchant guilds, a code of conduct even prohibited relieving oneself near tents, supply stacks, or walls. Violators were fined, or worse, excluded from caravan protection. And just like at home, there were rules. Guards used different facilities than scribes. Women's waste pots were never handled by male servants. Chamber pots had to be clearly marked. Painted symbols denoted the owner's rank and gender. One recovered pot had the character for quiet, carved in red lacquer on the lid, a gentle reminder to approach with respect. These systems weren't universal. Some caravans were messier, more improvised. But where Han influence was strong, so too was the impulse toward structure. Even in the wilderness, there was a desire to replicate the rhythms of home. Rise early, wash, use the privy, dispose with dignity. So, the next time you imagine a caravan on the Silk Road, don't just picture silk and spices. Picture the traders digging shallow trenches, the guards covering pots with ash, the scribe adjusting the lid on a lacquered waste jar before sunrise. Because in the long sweep of empires and commerce, even toilets had to travel. And in the middle of nowhere, with only the stars above and the camels below, a small wooden box could feel like civilization itself. But this raises a question. How far did these practices spread? And when traders crossed into foreign lands through Central Asia and into Persia, did they carry their toilets with them or adapt to the customs of others? As the Silk Road wound westward through oases, over snow-capped passes, and across scorching plains, the traders, envoys, and travelers who followed it carried more than silk, jade, and spices. They carried habits, customs, and yes, they carried their toilets. But the further they traveled from the Han heartland, the more those habits encountered other civilizations, each with its own sense of space, purity, and what to do when nature called. What's remarkable is that instead of conflict, what emerged was a quiet fusion. The toilet customs of Han China didn't always replace local norms. Instead, they blended, adapted, and, in some cases, quietly influenced the shape of sanitation across Eurasia. Let's begin in the Tarim Basin, where Han traders encountered Saka-speaking communities, nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples with unique approaches to hygiene. Excavations at the ancient city of Nia revealed shallow household pits surrounded by wicker fences, lined with straw, and occasionally scented with burned herbs. These were not unlike Han practices. though here there were fewer bamboo scrapers and more use of cloth or moss. Traders passing through brought their own supplies. Letters recovered from Nia include requests for sealed pots for the journey and instructions for repacking ash jars after use. Some traders even requested refills of vinegar or wormwood standard Han deodorizing agents. The implication is clear. Even on foreign soil, sanitation supplies were an essential part of caravan provisioning. But local influence went both ways. In the Sogdian cities of Central Asia, centers of trade, diplomacy, and culture, public toilets were common. These were often shared, gender-separated, and located near caravanserais. Unlike Han privies, which relied on ash or compost, Sogdian toilets used flowing water diverted from irrigation channels to flush waste away. This surprised many Han travelers who were used to dry systems. But quickly, they adapted. One Han scribe named Zhong Dan, whose fragmentary travel log survives on a silk scroll, marveled at the Sogdian lavatories of clean stone with fresh water and soft claws beside. His later notes mention building a small stream box for use in camp, a makeshift water-flushed privy using a bucket and funnel system. This is perhaps the earliest known record of a Han traveler adopting foreign toilet innovations. Further west, into the Parthian Empire, latrine practices varied widely. Some wealthy homes had clay-seated toilets connected to rudimentary drains, while rural populations relied on open fields. Chinese traders often stuck to their routines, using their own sealed pots or digging private trenches. But over time, habits shifted. Artifacts from a mixed Han-Parthian settlement in Margiana, modern-day Turkmenistan, include portable toilet jars with dual inscriptions, Chinese characters on one side, Aramaic script on the other. A shared pot for a shared camp. This cultural fusion wasn't just practical. It reflected mutual respect. As caravans became more diverse, with Chinese, Sogdian, Persian, and Indian merchants traveling together, sanitation practices became part of diplomatic etiquette. Guides explained where to dig latrines. Guards marked waste zones with painted stones. Porters were instructed to burn used cloths and refill vinegar jars before breaking camp. One recovered scroll from a Dunhuang depot even includes a sanitation checklist: water, ash, tent screen, chamber pot, scraper. 2. Mark waste trench. In these small routines, trust was built. To honor your companion's toilet customs was to show respect. To violate them, to relieve yourself near the tent, to leave waste uncovered, was a breach of caravan honor. Fines were issued. Some caravans maintained a written sanitation rota with names and duties listed. The tone was always gentle, but firm. Order preserved dignity. One curious example of shared sanitation space comes from a mixed caravan report preserved in a Khotan clay tablet archive. The note refers to a circle pit, a circular trench dug in the ground with wooden seating. Around it, each group was assigned a quadrant. The Han scribes decorated their quarter with brush-painted stones. The Sogdians used perfumed cloths. The Persians, it said, used rosewater. These practices, humble as they were, traveled further than we might expect. By the 2nd century CE, Han-influenced portable toilets were being crafted in cities like Samarkand and Merv. Local artisans adopted the sealed lid style. Pottery workshops began producing travelers' jars, stout ceramic vessels with lacquered covers and padding rings inside. Some even included finger loop handles for easier carrying, a feature unknown in traditional Han jars. And yet, for all this innovation, many travelers still clung to the old routines. A clay seal from a caravan packing crate in Dunhuang reads simply, "Privy goods, do not disturb." The label suggests not embarrassment, but pride. These were important tools, not shameful, but necessary. To pack the scraper was as vital as the scroll. Even in foreign courts, sanitation played a subtle role in diplomacy. When Chinese envoys visited Persian rulers, they brought gifts, including lacquerware, scrolls, medicinal herbs, and occasionally, finely crafted chamber pots. A Parthian letter fragment recovered near Susa mentions a gift of jade hue, polished smooth, and hollowed deep, most useful in times of privacy. A toilet, it seems, could also be a token of civility. So, as traders crossed deserts and mountains, they brought with them not just goods, but a slow, steady current of custom. A culture of care, a ritual of relief. And that leaves us wondering. As these traders returned home laden with stories, gold, and foreign innovations, did their toilets change? Did they keep the old ways, or did the desert teach them new comforts? The trade routes that wound westward eventually turned back east. With the creaking of carts and the padding of sand-worn feet, caravans returned to Han territory, some with riches, some with scars, and many with quiet lessons tucked away among their wares. One such lesson was this: even toilets can evolve. On the road, the traders who set out from Luoyang or Chang'an often did so with standard Han waste jars, bamboo scrapers, and travel etiquette drilled into memory. They were taught to dig discreet trenches, sprinkle ash, and honor the quiet discipline of morning routines. But the lands they passed through taught them alternatives: water flow sanitation in Sogdiana, rose-scented hygiene in Persia, pit lining in Bactria. And when they came home, they didn't forget. In returning homes, small but meaningful changes began to appear. Artisans in Dunhuang started crafting caravan-style pots, heavier, more stable, with tire-fitting lids inspired by Parthian models. Some households added folding screens or portable seats, imitating the compact travel tents used by women on the road. These weren't major shifts, but quiet refinements born not from the court, but from the caravans. Even household routines began to change. In some merchant homes, children learned both the ash method and the southernmost method, using water and cloth, a practice imported from further west. Traders instructed their staff to empty pots more frequently, clean, with warmed vinegar and citrus peel, and add perfumed herbs when guests arrived. Latrine care had become part of hospitality. One scroll fragment from the home of a retired merchant in Pingcheng contains a list of items given to his daughter as part of her dowry: chamber pot, ash jar, vinegar crock, and a traveler's privy box. This last item was described as folding, fragrant, lacquered black. The implication? Toilet care had become portable, not just for traders, but for migrating households. It was no longer only a road ritual. It was a traveling standard of civility. Interestingly, even in urban design, signs of caravan influence crept in. In relay stations built after 100 CE, toilet pits were dug with sloped stone surfaces for better drainage, perhaps inspired by Sogdian practices. Public privies near major markets began using clay pipes or small troughs to redirect waste away from walkways, a feature rare in earlier Han construction. It's likely these changes came from returning traders who, though low in the bureaucratic hierarchy, held deep practical knowledge. They had seen what worked in the desert, in foreign courts, under tents. And though they didn't write policy, they influenced it quietly. From the margins. In written records, we glimpse hints of this shift. A letter from a Han scribe stationed in Dunhuang, dated around 74 CE, remarks, "The foreigners relieve themselves with clean water. Their privy tents are small but fragrant. We would do well to copy them, especially in the heat." Elsewhere, a provincial governor writing to the Ministry of Works suggested standardizing travel privies. Let our emissaries not be shamed by poor habit when far from home. This may be the first formal suggestion to improve portable toilet design. for imperial envoys, not just merchants. Culturally, the merging of practices created a more flexible toilet etiquette. In homes that hosted travelers, different tools were kept: Han-style scrapers for the old, water jugs for the new. Cloths scented with mint or mugwort were laid out for guests. Latrine incense, once rare, became a quiet trend in upper middle class homes. Even chamber pot designs began to include decorative lids, echoing the painted symbols found on silk robe pots. And yet, despite these refinements, the heart of the practice remained unchanged. Each morning, the household still woke quietly. A servant stirred ash, a child fetched water, someone lit incense near the back wall. And somewhere in the house, an old traveler might squat over a simple stone seat, remember the dunes, and smile at the thought of a rose-scented pit under foreign stars. This is how cultures evolve, not with trumpets, but with toilets. What began as necessity became habit. What was once foreign became familiar. What started on a dusty trail between oases now shaped how people relieved themselves behind tile-roofed homes. And so, the portable toilet, humble, ignored, yet faithfully packed, became a quiet bridge between worlds. It connected empires not only through trade, but through daily care. A seat, a jar, a scoop of ash repeated endlessly until it felt like home. And perhaps that's the final lesson of the Silk Road toilets, that civilization is not only the temples we build, but the rituals we carry, especially when we think no one is watching. So here's a final thought. In the ruins of our own age, what portable rituals will archaeologists find in our luggage? The capital city of Luoyang was a place of great spectacle. The Han emperors held court beneath grand eaves. Scholars recited the Analects in public academies. Merchants filled the markets with silk, lacquer, and grain. But beneath all the pomp, at street level, there was another kind of worker anonymous. Uncelebrated and vital. They were the Si Ting Ji, known simply as the latrine guards, dressed in coarse robes and marked by a narrow sash bearing the city's sanitation seal. These men and boys stood watch over the city's public toilets. Their post? A roofed shack beside a trench or pit, tucked behind marketplaces, way stations, and government offices. Their job? To keep the toilets clean, stocked, and above all else orderly. In an empire obsessed with bureaucracy, these men were considered low caste, unimportant in court rankings, and omitted from temple records. But in Luoyang's daily rhythm, they were indispensable. The latrine guard was part janitor, part attendant, part informal street official. His presence was a small promise that even the most overlooked corners of the city had someone paying attention. Let us walk the street at dawn. A latrine guard begins his day long before the rest of the city stirs. He lights a small oil lamp to check for rats, snakes, or worse, loose waste left on the surrounding stones. He sprinkles ash or lime into the pit to keep odors at bay. If the toilet has a seat, usually a smooth stone slab over a brick vault, he wipes it down with vinegar and worn cloth. If the toilet is merely a trench, he checks its depth, its cover, and the position of the bamboo scrapers hanging nearby. He hangs fresh cloths or replaces the jar of rinse water. If the district is wealthy, he lights a cone of wormwood incense. If it's not, he relies on ash and discipline. And then he waits. Latrines in Han Luoyang were built in busy places, near inns, behind guild halls, in alleyways flanking government blocks. They were often shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds of passers-by each day. And so, order was needed. People lined up. The guard kept time. In wealthier quarters, a guard might be stationed with a bell, a soft chime to signal when a user had taken too long. In poorer wards, the guards used tapping sticks or sharp coughs. Some even developed reputations for strictness. Records from Luoyang's city archive describe one such man old, Yao, who fined an official scribe for urinating too close to the scraper jar. He was reprimanded. Then quietly reinstated latrine guards also dealt with more than sanitation. They managed disputes. When two market porters fought over whose turn it was, the guard mediated. When someone tried to cut the line or bring a stolen pot into the stall, the guard called over the nearest patrol. In this way, he functioned as a kind of informal constable, a manager of queues, tempers, and bodily urgency. But there were dangers. 2. Night shifts were the most dreaded. Luoyang streets, though lit by the occasional lantern, were often lawless after sunset. Latrine guards on the night watch carried sticks, sometimes knives. Thieves occasionally hid in the shadows behind. Toilet stalls. Spirits, too, were feared, especially in winter, when foul vapors were thought to attract malevolent ghosts. To ward off such fears, guards posted amulets, paper charms, or scraps of poetry on the walls. One guard, stationed near the merchant quarter, carved this phrase into the latrine gate: "Enter with respect. Leave no trace. All waste returns to soil, as do we." All waste returns to soil, as do we. These men were rarely thanked, but they were noticed. Market vendors brought them steamed buns in the morning. Porters offered flasks of warm millet wine in winter. A grateful official, whose son was safely returned after getting stuck in a privy trench, once gave a latrine guard a pair of new straw sandals and an old silk robe. The guards kept logs of sorts, scratched into wood or pressed into clay tablets. They recorded maintenance needs, number of users, foul smells, or damage. These logs, sent weekly to sanitation overseers, became part of Luoyang's urban records. From them, modern historians have reconstructed foot traffic patterns, market hours, and even public health trends. But the real story lies in what was never written: the quiet honor of standing guard over the city's least noble yet most necessary space. The small rituals: pouring vinegar, scraping the stone, folding cloths. The trust placed in a man whose name no one remembered, but whose presence meant the difference between dignity and disgust. By the end of his shift, the guard might squat outside the latrine door, sip weak tea, and watch the sun rise over the tiled rooftops. He would not be praised. He would not be paid well, but he had done his part. So we ask, why were these men never mentioned in the scrolls of the great? And in forgetting their names, what part of civilization did we lose? By mid-morning, in Han-era Luoyang, the city stirred to life in full measure. Grain sellers shouted their waits. Scholars paced courtyards with scrolls in hand. The rhythmic slap of laundry echoed from wells and rooftops. And in the shadows of all this, the latrine guards carried on, watchful, wordless, tending to the city's least praised but most used civic spaces. Each public latrine had its own rhythm, determined by location, class, and traffic. A latrine behind a scholar's district saw early morning use, with soft-footed students queuing before lectures. A market-side trench bustled from late morning until the heat of the afternoon. A structure near a transport relay might see continuous use well into the night by horse grooms, porters, messengers. The guard's job was to know this rhythm and work around it. He timed cleanings during lulls. He replaced vinegar jars before the rush. He knew the habits of his regulars, who brought their own cloth, who always asked for a scraper, who lingered too long. And he kept notes, mental or written, of anything unusual. Sometimes he saw things no magistrate did. Lovers meeting secretly, pausing at the shared privy gate. Drunk officials relieving themselves against the side wall and tipping the guard to forget. Traveling actors applying face paint in the latrine mirror before a street show. A man sobbing quietly over a letter he read in the privacy of a toilet stall. The guard saw it all and said nothing. Though often solitary, the job did involve a degree of coordination. Routes were passed down through apprenticeships, marked by landmarks, a cracked lantern pole, a crooked mulberry tree, the corner where the stray cats always fought. A good Fen Shi knew his way through every alley, every hidden turn. He knew which houses had steep steps, which households used too much vinegar in their toilet jars, and which residents were likely to toss coins from upper windows if he worked quietly. The tools of the trade were simple: a sturdy yoke for balance, thick hemp claws wrapped around the shoulders to prevent chafing, a bamboo ladle for transferring waste, and a flat-topped scraper for cleaning surfaces. The most valued item was the bucket lid, a tight-fitting wooden disc with a carved groove to prevent sloshing. A well-sealed bucket meant a safer journey and fewer complaints from the neighbors. Hygiene was an ever-present concern. Many Fen She bathed in the river after their routes, scrubbing themselves with sand and ash. Some carried scented pouches or bundles of wormwood to mask the odor. In some cities, local temples provided cleansing rituals or public baths where these workers could wash before returning home. Despite the physical toll, they took pride in their routine. As one anonymous poem scratched into the back wall of a latrine read, "Each night I walk where no one sees. By dawn, I vanish with the breeze. No gold, no praise, but still I go, the silent keeper of the flow." Interestingly, the Han government did not completely ignore the Fen Shi. While rarely praised, their work was regulated. Municipal codes in cities like Chang'an and Luoyang listed expectations for latrine cleaning frequency, waste disposal zones, and the hours during which collection could legally occur. Violating these rules carried fines or, in rare cases, lashings. A collector who dumped waste too close to a well or watercourse might find himself barred from the trade entirely. The collectors had their own informal networks. They gathered at tea stalls on the outskirts of town after finishing their rounds, sipping cheap brews laced with ginger to stave off illness. There, they swapped stories of odd finds, rings, coins, even the occasional small figurine mistakenly flushed into the bucket. There were stories, too, of haunted latrines, ghostly voices in alleyways, and houses that no collector would approach alone. Despite their low status, the Fen Shi knew secrets. They overheard arguments through thin courtyard walls. They saw which households used foreign spices in their food. They noted which scholars drank too much plum wine and which officials had guests over when their wives were away. They were, in their own way, chroniclers of the city's hidden life. By daybreak, the city awoke. The Fen Shi disappeared into their compounds beyond the walls, where waste was sorted into open pits or large jars for curing. Some waste was burned, some was buried, but most was saved, precisely measured, occasionally stirred, and eventually sold to waiting farmers. And so the cycle continued. As we leave behind this silent procession of workers, trudging through misty streets with the empire's least glamorous cargo, one can't help but wonder, what drove these men to do this work, day after day, for so little praise? Was it duty? Survival? Pride in a quiet kind of order? To most eyes, a bucket of night soil would seem the lowest commodity repellent. Shameful, a necessary evil best forgotten. But in Han Dynasty China, this dark matter held real value. Beneath the surface of stench and stigma was an economy silent, persistent, and surprisingly profitable. As cities like Luoyang and Chang'an expanded, so too did the demand for food. Feeding a population of hundreds of thousands required more than just labor. It required fertile land, reliable crop cycles, and nutrient-rich soil. And therein lay the paradox. What people flushed away became the very thing that sustained them. Night soil, when properly aged and applied, was among the best fertilizers available. Rich in nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, it was considered essential for growing wheat, millet, and vegetables. Han farmers, ever pragmatic, referred to it as black gold. A full jar could be bartered for produce, dry goods, or even firewood. It was not uncommon for urban collectors to develop steady trading relationships with rural farmers and early sanitation for sustenance exchange. This gave rise to an informal, decentralized market. Some Fenshi became middlemen, collecting from households in town and selling directly to farmers on the outskirts. Others partnered with local guilds or merchant groups who managed distribution. Even inns and government compounds participated. In this economy, auctioning off their waste to the highest bidder during planting season. The Han government, ever attuned to flows of grain, silver, people, began to take notice. In certain provinces, officials introduced waste licensing systems. Collectors who wished to transport and sell night soil across district lines had to register and pay a nominal fee, recorded in simple ledgers on bamboo slips. It wasn't quite a tax, but it was a start. Over time, in more developed regions, local administrators began treating waste collection as a public utility. Contracts were issued to collection families, granting them exclusive rights to certain districts. In return, they were required to submit quarterly reports and maintain basic sanitation standards. If waste overflowed or neighbors complained, the contract could be revoked. What did these reports look like? Surprisingly detailed. Surviving fragments of local administrative texts, preserved in dry cave libraries or buried in tombs, revealed tallies of latrine volumes, compost pit locations, and seasonal waste demand charts. These documents, far from being mere trivia, tell us that the management of filth had become a logistical art. Waste routes were mapped. Collection quotas were set based on population density. In high-demand seasons, just before spring planting extra, collectors were hired, some traveling from neighboring towns. Payment might be in coin, millet, or bundles of kindling. Records even note price fluctuations, depending on the consistency and storage condition of the waste, a crude but honest form of quality control. Private entrepreneurs emerged. 2. Wealthy merchants began investing in waste collection buying equipment, hiring workers, and expanding their operations. Some even built dedicated compost fields outside the city, where night soil could be cured, filtered, and sold in bulk to large landowners. These waste farms, as they were called, became hubs of quiet industry. Laborers turned piles with long wooden paddles, monitored the composting process, and sold the final product in thick blocks wrapped in straw. Of course, such economic activity was not without conflict. Rival collector groups clashed over routes. There are accounts, albeit fragmentary, of waste wars in which buckets were sabotaged, yokes stolen, or waste dumped in competitor pits out of spite. City guards were occasionally dispatched to mediate these disputes, though such interventions were rare. After all, to publicly air one's grievances about stolen excrement was to invite ridicule. Despite these tensions, the night soil economy contributed to social mobility, albeit in modest terms. A particularly successful Fenshi might earn enough to send his son to a temple school or to build a second room on the family home. Some bought land on the city's edge and began farming themselves, completing the cycle of waste to harvest on. There were even small symbols of status within this invisible hierarchy. A well-maintained bucket lid, an iron-reinforced yoke, a neatly patched shoulder cloth. These were signs of professionalism. Collectors who worked cleanly and kept a schedule earned grudging respect. Some households requested specific collectors by name, slipping them extra coins at New Year for their reliable service. And yet, the job remained stigmatized. No matter how well they worked, Fenshi were still seen as lowly. Their children might be barred from certain schools. Their wives might be excluded from temple ceremonies. But within their own ranks, they shared a sense of pride. They knew the streets better than the magistrates. They knew the city's rhythms, its smells, its silences. One collector's notebook, recovered from a sealed jar near Luoyang, offers a rare personal account. The man, who signed his name simply as Old Lin, kept records of his daily routes, trades, and thoughts. The North Alley pays in cabbage, the wine house in coin. The baker leaves crusts. New family on Jade Street, heavy buckets. Use the wide road, not the lane by the dogs. Spring wind smells different this year. Perhaps too much night soil in the east fields. Old Lin's quiet observations reveal. Man who, though denied status, saw deeply into the pulse of his city. By the end of the Eastern Han, night soil collection had become an entrenched part of urban life. When civil wars fractured the empire and cities fell into disrepair, one of the first signs of collapse was the pileup of waste. Latrines overflowed. Buckets went uncollected. The quiet workers had vanished, and with them went a vital part of civic life. But if the system had worked so well, for so long across cities and generations, what lessons did it leave behind? What happened to this hidden workforce when imperial priorities shifted? As the Han Dynasty waned in the 2nd century CE, the grand order it had cultivated for 4 centuries began to unravel. Corruption, famine, and rebellion gnawed at the empire's edges. Warlords divided provinces, imperial authority weakened, and the finely tuned machinery of civic life erodes. Taxation, record-keeping, and sanitation began to falter. Among the first casualties of this breakdown were the systems no one praised, but everyone depended upon. The night soil collectors, those quiet walkers of dawn, began to disappear. It wasn't sudden. In some cities, services continued for years, under local governors or enterprising families. But as war spread and towns were razed, the streets emptied. Latrines overflowed. Buckets remained uncollected. In many regions, once thriving waste economies collapsed entirely. Without order, there was no sanitation. Without sanitation, disease soon followed. Ironically, it was in their absence that the Fenshi were finally noticed. In desperate reports to provincial courts, scribes noted the foul smells in once proud markets, the unusable roads slick with human waste. A ruined latrine became a symbol of broader collapse. Archaeologists have found layers of compacted waste over Han streets in abandoned cities, once cleared nightly, now left to rot as the empire fractured. And yet, the system never truly died. In the centuries that followed, the practice of night soil collection resurfaced in dynasties great and small. From the Three Kingdoms to the Tang and Song, variations of the Fenshi returned. The job was renamed, restructured, even ceremonially, blessed in some Taoist temples. But its core function remained the same, a quiet guardian of cleanliness in a crowded world. What changed was the perception of their role. In later dynasties, particularly the Tang, public recognition of sanitation grew. Cities like Chang'an and Kaifeng employed state-paid waste collectors with uniforms, scheduled routes, and official ranks low but recognized. Latrine zones were planned more deliberately, compost fields were regulated, and civic pride increasingly included the cleanliness of back alleys. The Han had planted the seed. The world had seen what was possible when even excrement was managed with order. Culturally, however, the stigma endured. The Fenshi remained part of the mean class. Their children found it hard to rise beyond their parents' roles. Marriages with other social classes were rare. While emperors received praise for reforming tax systems or promoting poetry, no one wrote odes to the night soil men. The work, as always, was invisible. And yet, their legacy endures in surprising ways. For example, the practice of collecting human waste for fertilizer continued across East Asia well into the 20th century. In Japan, Korea, and parts of southern China, night soil remained a staple of agricultural life. Modern toilets and sewer systems did not replace this practice fully until the post-war industrial age. Even then, some rural farmers insisted their vegetables grew better with traditional fertiliser. In historical writing, a subtle shift occurred in the late 20th century. With the rise of urban anthropology and sanitation history, scholars began examining waste systems as serious infrastructure. Archaeologists started documenting latrines with the same attention given to palaces and temples. Bamboo slips detailing latrine finds, ceramic scoops, and compost jars were cataloged and displayed in museums. And slowly, the fenshi began to appear in textbooks, not as curiosities, but as contributors. A handful of modern historians now argue that without their efforts, Han urbanization would have stalled. Disease would have spread. Food security would have faltered. These men, they suggest, formed the invisible scaffolding that kept civilization upright. But perhaps their most enduring contribution lies not in compost or tax records, but in the moral philosophy they embodied: unrecognized service, daily discipline, and quiet duty performed in darkness. In a world obsessed with status and spectacle, the fenshi stood apart. They were the ultimate civil servants, unthanked, unnoticed, but absolutely necessary. Old Lin, whose humble journal offered glimpses into their world, had one more entry worth sharing. If no one sees me, then let the streets speak. If no one knows me, let the wheat remember. I carry what others cast away. That is my place. These are not the words of a broken man. They are the words of someone who understood his place in a grander design. Someone who knew that the strength of an empire was not measured only in its walls or scrolls, but in whether it could keep its streets clean by dawn. So as the modern world flushes its way through life, largely unaware of the pipes beneath and the workers behind them, it's worth asking, what quiet roles today keep us civilized? And when those systems fail, when the dirty work is left undone, what parts of our own empires begin to rot first? In the grand court of Emperor Wu of Han, most attention was paid to military conquests, Confucian reforms, and the expansion of the Silk Road. Statues would be carved, poems composed, and edicts remembered for centuries in scrolls of silk and ink. But buried within the mountains of records from this era, often overlooked, lies a surprising and very unglamorous chapter: the empire-wide standardization of human waste removal. That's right. In the golden age of Han governance, as diplomats parleyed and philosophers debated the moral fabric of state, officials were also deeply concerned with a more humble subject: how to collect, move, and manage human excrement across a territory of over 5 million square kilometers. It might seem strange that Emperor Wu, famed for his centralization of power and Confucian statecraft, would turn his gaze to latrines. But like every good administrator, he understood that order begins at the ground level, quite literally. And so, as early as 110 BCE, imperial decrees began circulating that mentioned household sanitation compliance, night waste redistribution, and district compost accountability. These were not isolated scribbles. They were part of a coordinated campaign to bring uniformity to the most basic acts of daily life, and to weave them into the imperial system. Let's set the scene. Luoyang, the secondary capital, is brimming with activity. Markets bustle. Students chant in academies. But in the alleys behind the shops, a group of junior officials from the Ministry of Works is inspecting household latrines. They carry measuring sticks, tally slips, and wax tablets. Their goal? To verify whether the new privy-size regulations are being followed. According to a 2nd century copy of the Gongshu, the hand manual on civil regulations, urban toilets were to be no more than 4 chi wide, around 1.3 meters. Located no closer than 2 jiang, 6.6 meters. to a public well and must include a drainage slope no less than 1 finger's width per chi of distance. Officials were expected to enforce these measures with both flexibility and discipline, depending on local conditions. But who created these regulations? Who thought to draw lines from privies to pits? Entered the Ministry of Agriculture and Works, one of the most technical arms of Han bureaucracy. By the mid-2nd century BCE, this ministry had grown increasingly powerful. Responsible for roads, irrigation, market layout, and farming manuals, they eventually turned their attention to waste. At first, they simply issued guidelines for rural composting, how long to ferment waste, how deep to bury it, and what materials, lime, straw, worked best for odor reduction. Then, things escalated. With Emperor Wu's backing, inspectors were sent to major urban centers to assess the state of public hygiene. Their reports were not encouraging. In the southern markets of Chang'an, latrines overflowed during summer rains. In northern provinces, waste was dumped too close to granaries, attracting insects. The emperor, famously allergic to disorder, demanded reform. The result was the first known imperial waste control directive, issued in 104 BCE. It read, in part, whereas filth in public and private places offends the nose, clouds the air, and breeds imbalance in the flow of vital qi, let it be decreed that all city prefects shall appoint waste monitors, who shall oversee the placement, collection, and final use of human discharge for the sake of crop, climate, and civic order. Waste monitors, Sichi Guan, were appointed across the empire. Their duties included recording the location of public toilets, ensuring timely collection of night soil, issuing fines for improper dumping, and coordinating with farming districts to distribute compost. In areas near canals, they were responsible for ensuring that waste did not contaminate drinking water, a task that, while noble, often proved nearly impossible. To help these officials, the emperor authorized the creation of standardized tools: clay measuring pots for night soil volumes, ladles of specific length and curvature. Even an official government-issued latrine blueprint, carved into wooden blocks, which could be copied and shared across provinces. In the imperial court, the reforms were mocked in whispers. One scholar, Liu Hang, joked that no minister before has carried both scroll and shovel in his robe. But the emperor was unmoved. For him, waste removal was part of statecraft. He had no tolerance for mismanaged cities. There was a kind of code among them. Across Luoyang, guards developed signals, knocking patterns, shoulder gestures, brief nods to communicate without speech. They shared tools. A warm bamboo scraper passed between stalls might carry a Mark III. Carved lines to signal the pot was full. A length of cloth hung at the door, folded just so, meant do not enter cleaning in progress. Some guards even passed advice to each other. You'll want to watch for coin thieves squad, but listen. Scholar Lee talks to himself in the third stall, don't interrupt. During festival days, burn wormwood twice. The smell gets worse after dusk. There were no manuals, but there were traditions. Apprentices, often sons or nephews, learned the trade through observation. They began as errand runners, carrying buckets of ash or vinegar. Slowly, they were trusted with more, folding cloths, managing queues, even handling complaints. After a few seasons, they were ready to guard alone. But the job wasn't easy. Rain turned latrine yards to mud. Summer heat made odors unbearable. Winter froze the seats. At night, there were rats and thieves, and the constant fear of being blamed for something left behind: broken pots, missing items, even secret messages. Yes, messages. The public latrine, for all its humble function, was a perfect place to pass information unseen. A scratched mark on a stall wall might mean all clear. A tied ribbon on a scraper handle could signal an upcoming meeting. Latrine guards, knowingly or not, stood beside the city's quietest channels of communication. Some became informants, passing details to officials in exchange for coin. Others turned a blind eye. Still others, perhaps the most dignified, swept the messages away, believing that even secret dealings didn't belong in a space meant for relief and dignity. Still, a few guards were celebrated in their own way. There's record of one, simply called Wen, who served for over 25 years outside the Southern Magistrates' Hall. He was known for humming while he cleaned, reciting old folk poems while scrubbing vinegar into stone seats. When he died, the market women raised coins for a small incense ceremony. Someone carved a stone and left it near the latrine gate. It read, "He watched while others waited. He cleaned what others left." The city's dirt did not reach his heart. It's a rare tribute. Most guards went to unmarked graves. Their tools were burned or passed along. Their names vanished into registry margins or not at all. But their presence lingered in habits, in quiet order, in the knowledge that someone cared enough to stand beside the city's most basic boundary between cleanliness and chaos. In modern Luoyang, you won't find statues of latrine guards. But in the remains of the old city beneath layers of stone and clay, archaeologists have found stall walls with scrape marks, pot fragments, jars of ash. Evidence still whispering of men who once stood watch in the humblest places. But it leads us to ask, if they guarded our thresholds of cleanliness, who guards theirs? Who ensured they were fed, heard, respected? As the Eastern Han neared its final century, Luoyang became a city under strain. Droughts struck the countryside. Floods battered canal walls. Eunuchs whispered in the palace. Rebel banners rose in distant provinces. But through it all, the latrines still opened each morning, and the guards stood beside them. Until, slowly, they didn't dot. It didn't happen all at once. The earliest signs were subtle. The vinegar jars stayed empty longer. The bamboo scrapers cracked and weren't replaced. Ash buckets went missing. Patrons waited longer, complained more. In some quarters, the stalls filled with flies by midday. City's rhythm had broken. Why? Because bureaucracy, once the great pride of Han governance, was fraying. Inspectors were recalled. Civic funds were redirected to military fronts. Some sanitation supervisors were arrested for corruption. Others simply fled. In the absence of oversight, guards were left unpaid. Many quit. Others begged for bread outside the very stalls they used to clean. Still, a few remained, out of habit, out of pride, or perhaps because they understood something the magistrates had forgotten, that even when the empire trembled, people still needed somewhere to squat. An anonymous poem, etched in the soft clay behind a latrine near Luoyang's West Market, reads, "When scholars fled and coins lost weight, he stayed beside the stone. No fanfare, no seal, no robe, only vinegar and time and waste." It's unclear who wrote it. A fellow guard? A poet? A passing merchant, struck by the sight of an old man sweeping with calloused hands while the city burned. By the year 189, CE civil war gripped the land. The capital shifted. Power fractured. And the latrine guards, those watchers of ash and trench, vanished from the records, but not from memory. Generations later, in the Tang Dynasty, poets spoke of the quiet dignity of low work. In sanitation edicts from the Song Dynasty, echoes of Han procedures reappeared. Morning cleanings, scraper logs, vinegar treatments. The tone was formal, the context new, but the roots traced back to those forgotten guards of Luoyang. Their discipline outlived them. We don't know their full names. No one recorded their birthdays or the number of shifts they endured. But we know their tools. We know their smells, their routines, their songs. We know the rhythm of their work, how early they rose, how carefully they folded the cloth, How? Often they were ignored. And in a way, that's a kind of immortality. Because while emperors fade into stone and scholars into scrolls, the latrine guard's legacy remains in every well-maintained public stall, every morning sweep of ash, every sign asking users to be courteous. The spirit of their service, unseen, unthanked, unyielding, runs beneath civilization like the quietest of aqueducts. So let us end with a question, not for them, but for ourselves. If those who keep the world clean go unnamed, what does it say about the stories we choose to tell? Story 8. What Han doctors believed about digestive health and why toilets mattered. In the marble silence of the Han Court's Medical Academy, beneath hanging scrolls of meridian diagrams and herbal compendiums, a student was once asked a deceptively simple question: what organ governs wisdom? The expected answer wasn't the heart. It wasn't the mind. It was the stomach. To the Han physician, the gut was not just the site of digestion. It was the center of balance, a crucible of ki, a barometer of cosmic harmony. And if the stomach faltered, so too did clarity, courage, and even virtue. Illnesses of the belly were not just physical. They were moral and spiritual misalignments. And so, unsurprisingly, the toilet, though rarely glorified, became an instrument of diagnosis. Let's start with the doctors themselves. Han Dynasty medicine was an intricate weave of Taoist theory, herbal practice, and patient observation. There was no concept of germs, but there was a robust system of patterns: hot and cold, moist and dry, internal and external. Physicians diagnosed through pulse readings, tongue color, breathing patterns. And yes, stool consistency. In fact, one of the most respected texts of the era, the Huang Di Neijing, the inner classic of the Yellow Emperor, devotes considerable attention to bowel movement harmony. Diarrhea, constipation, bloating, sour gas, these were all signs that the balance of the spleen-stomach system was off. A young doctor might be sent to examine a patient's toilet pit. He would crouch, not flinch, and record notes. Loose and pale cold in the stomach, dry and dark internal heat, slick with undigested grain-weak spleen ki. Physicians carried long-handled ladles, not just for mixing medicine, but for inspecting waste. Some even kept samples sealed in clay jars for closer analysis. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. And so the latrine became an extension of the medical chamber. In wealthier households, a doctor might be invited to view the latrine pit itself. He would observe the layers, recent waste atop older compost, fresh bamboo scrapers nearby. He might stir gently with a stick, noting color, smell, or presence of blood. Herbal treatments followed quickly. Constipation? Warm water, plus rhubarb root, da huang, known for its purging effects. Diarrhea? Cooked yam or powdered lotus seed to stabilize the middle burner. Gas and bloating? A tea of dried tangerine peel and fennel seed. But toilet wasn't just a diagnostic tool, it was part of the cure. Doctors often advised toilet routines. Patients were told when to squat, always after dawn, never late at night. How to wipe, always front to back, using vinegar-soaked cloth if ill. And how long to linger, no more than 20 breaths. Less ki escape with the waste. Children were trained early in these rhythms, particularly if the family had a history of cold stomach or weakened spleen. Mothers boiled fennel water to rinse the bamboo scrapers. Grandmothers tied medicinal herbs inside latrine lids. Even the direction a toilet faced north was preferred, was believed to impact digestive flow. And then there were the dreams. Some Han doctors believed that dreams of falling, flooding, or being trapped in holes indicated digestive trouble. If a man dreams of being buried, wrote one physician, his bowels are dry and unmoving. Give rhubarb and observe. Toilets, in this sense, became a space where the unseen became visible. The emperor's own physicians kept meticulous records of bowel movements. Palace scribes note daily reports filed from the privies of the inner court. An entry from the reign of Emperor Chang reads, "The yellow one passed waste thrice today. Formed, no blood, slight odor. Appetite strong. Prescribed nothing." This was not gossip. It was governance. A healthy gut meant a healthy throne. And if the emperor showed signs of irregularity, panic followed. Officials whispered. Doctors argued over whether to purge or nourish. And always, quietly, the latrine was checked off beyond diagnosis. Toilets were also used in preventive medicine. Sitting too long? Risk of key stagnation. Straining? Risk of downward collapse. Not enough time in the toilet. Improper elimination. Han physicians advise slow, mindful evacuation, ideally after herbal teas or warm millet gruel. It was said that a balanced man passes waste with no sound, no pain, and no mark upon the scraper. Yet for all these rituals, the medical latrine remained a private, even sacred space. Patients rarely discussed their habits openly, but doctors insisted. "Tell me of your stool," a senior physician might say, "and I shall tell you of your future." And so we must ask, if toilets were so central to Han medicine, what happened when people avoided them? When shame or neglect prevented observation? And what truly did doctors do when illness refused to flush itself away? By the Min-Han period, medicine had become an increasingly systematized craft. Physicians carried compendiums, herbal packets, pulse manuals, and, in some cases, small lacquered boxes holding diagnostic sticks for latrine analysis. These weren't superstition. They were science in its earliest, earthiest form, and for the Han doctor, no diagnosis was complete until the patient's digestion had been thoroughly explored. Let's step into a middle-class household in Luoyang. A young boy has fallen ill, low appetite, lethargy, a dull yellow cast to the skin. The family physician arrives, bows low, and begins. He feels the boy's pulse. He examines his tongue. He asks detailed questions about sleep, dreams, chills. And then, calmly and without embarrassment, he asks to inspect the latrine. The family leads him to a stone-ringed pit at the back of the home, where the boy's chamber pot has been emptied. The physician kneels, wafts the air gently toward his, knows with his sleeve, and peers inside with narrowed eyes. Loose, pale, but with undigested grain. The spleen key is weak. He prescribes ginseng and lotus seed with a decoction of 6 gentle herbs to strengthen the middle. And he advises, let the child relieve himself only in the morning. Do not allow midday squat. Use warm cloths. Burn dried ginger nearby. For the Han doctor, bowel regularity was not merely a sign of good health. It was its very foundation. Constipation, for instance, was seen as the result of internal heat, often from overwork, excess worry, or spicy foods. To relieve it, doctors might prescribe dawang rhubarb root, a bitter, cooling herb that purges heat and moves the bowels. Manshao, mirabolite salt, dissolved in warm water to soften hardness. Hemp seed tea, mild and nourishing, used in children and elders. If the opposite problem struck frequent loose stools or watery diarrhea, the diagnosis pointed to internal cold or dampness. Prescriptions might include dried ginger and aconite to warm the interior, yam and gorgon fruit to strengthen spleen function and stop leakage, sticky rice porridge consumed with powdered cinnamon bark. Toilets became part of these treatments. Families were told not just what to eat or drink, but how and when to relieve themselves, and toilets were adjusted accordingly. In colder seasons, sheets were wrapped in cloth or warmed with hot stones to prevent cold entering through the base. In summer, cooling herbs, mint, chrysanthemum, even powdered pearl were burned near the pit to keep excessive heat from rising. Bamboo scrapers were soaked in vinegar or herbal decoctions, depending on the condition being treated. Even the act of squatting mattered. Han texts advise correct posture, spine straight, feet firm, shoulders relaxed. Improper position, they warned, could cause key blockage and strain to the lower C. Elders were given wooden stools to rest their knees. Some households even kept a handrail by the latrine for comfort. Early accessibility design, born of respect. Doctors made home visits, not just to observe patients, but to inspect toilet maintenance. A clean, quiet privy meant balance in the household. A foul or overflowing pit suggested neglect, not only of the body, but of order itself. Han doctors didn't stop at herbs. They used food therapeutically, often tailored to bowel movements. Softened plums for mild constipation, jujube fruit and glutinous rice for diarrhea, fermented soybean broth for poor digestion, black sesame congee for dry intestines. They even had toilet fasting regimens advising patients to skip relief for a morning or delay it after eating certain meals to guide the key downward gently. These were often paired with stretching, deep breathing, and slow walks around the courtyard. Still, not every patient followed instructions. Doctors kept notes on known compliance. One surviving tablet, unearthed in a southern tomb, reads, "Patient Lee continues to squat in the evening against advice. Complains of sluggish bowels. Prescribed rhubarb. Refuses scraper." Such notes were not rare. Patients, then as now, often disregarded doctors' orders, especially when they involved something as intimate as toilet habits. There was, however, one group who followed orders strictly: palace staff. And the Han court. The emperor's inner circle included a team of medical scribes whose only duty was to track digestion. They recorded waste color, consistency, frequency, and smell. They even noted the emperor's expression and posture during defecation. If he sighed deeply or leaned to one side, this was interpreted as a sign of imbalance. It sounds absurd. But it wasn't about obsession, it was about longevity. To live well meant to eliminate well. And so, toilets, those quiet recesses at the edge of household and empire, became critical sites of care. So we must ask, when digestion refused to improve, even with herbs and prayer, what tools remained? What did doctors do when the seat was clean? The herbs were right, but the belly still rebelled. When all remedies had failed, when herbs had been steeped, posture corrected, and toilets kept warm, yet the bowels still refused to move. The Han physician reached into the final layers of his craft. Because in the Han worldview, stubborn, digestion was never just about food. It was about life force. A constipated body might reflect a constipated spirit. A diarrheic gut could signal excessive sorrow. Doctors were not only healers, they were interpreters. The gut was where the physical and the emotional met, and the toilet was the silent confessional where imbalances made themselves known. This belief wasn't poetic flourish. It had practical implications. When treatments didn't work, a physician might prescribe stillness, not new medicine, not stronger purgatives, but quiet. He would ask the patient to withdraw, to sit in an empty room, burn incense, and regard the stomach with soft thought. It was believed that introspection could soften the belly. Just as wind softens the field. In extreme cases, ritual was used. One preserved text, the Treatise on Harmonious Movements, describes a ceremony in which the family of the patient would cleanse the household toilet. They would boil vinegar, scrub the seat, hang a fresh cloth, and recite, "Let waste leave as wind. Let grief pass like broth. Let the seat be clean, and the belly brave." It wasn't magical thinking. It was symbolic. Resetting. The latrine, so long a diagnostic tool, now became part of the cure. The very space had to be restored. Still, there were practical methods when symbolism fell short. Enemas, though rarely discussed, were used in the Han era. Long bamboo tubes wrapped in oilcloth and inserted gently would carry warm herbal infusions into the bowel. These procedures were delicate and often administered by women or female attendants in aristocratic households. For commoners, the method involved a simple hollow reed and a teapot of decoction. The ingredients varied. One formula called for boiled garlic to dispel parasites, fennel and ginger to warm and move, hemp oil to lubricate, wine dregs to stimulate. If this failed, physicians might turn to fire therapy, warming the belly with heated stones, wrapped in cloth, or they'd apply cupping jars along the lower back to draw trapped wind. Moxibustion, too burning dried mugwort near the navel, was thought to stir the spleen into action. All of this was centered on the idea that the gut must move, not violently, not forcefully, but rhythmically, naturally, with respect. And so toilets remained central to this process, not merely as final destinations for waste, but as instruments of healing. They were cared for with new tenderness in this phase of treatment, cleaned more often, scented with peach wood or sandalwood. In some cases, a quiet offering was made, placing 3 jujube, fruits on the seat or lid, as a symbolic gift to the spirit of the lower house. Even the final expulsion, when it finally came, was observed with ceremony. Doctors advised noting the time of day. Patients were told to rinse the seat afterward, not just for hygiene, but to close the cycle of disorder. Family members might nod in quiet approval. The physician would smile faintly and return his scroll to his sleeve, and once again, the world would feel right. Hand doctors did not separate the body from its surroundings. To them, the seat of waste was as sacred as the pillow of sleep. The latrine was not low, it was foundational. The place where imbalance declared itself, and where balance returned. So, we close this chapter with a quiet question. If the Han knew that health began at the toilet through daily care, observation, and reverence, why do we so often treat our own with indifference? And if a bamboo scraper, warm stone, and moment of silence could heal a failing gut, what other small rituals are we overlooking in our rush toward modern wellness? Story 9. Chamber Pots and Gossip. Toilet culture in the lives of Han women step beyond the main hall of a Han household and into the inner chambers, where embroidered curtains sway softly in the breeze, and the world is quieter, slower, and more deliberate. This is the realm of women mothers, daughters, aunts, wet nurses, maids, and within it, beneath all the foot-binding cloth and cinnabar rouge, rests a sturdy, ever-present tool. The chamber pot. It sat in the corner of bedrooms, beside vanity boxes near incense tables. It was lacquered or plain, hidden under cloth, or placed in ornate wooden cradles. And it wasn't merely a toilet. In many households, it was part of a woman's daily rhythm, a private anchor in a world governed by formality, hierarchy, and the subtle exertion of control. Let's start with the basics. Unlike the outdoor latrines used by men and male servants, Han women, especially of the middle and upper classes, used indoor chamber pots for daily relief, particularly at night or during illness, menstruation, or pregnancy. They were practical, portable, decorated, and intimate. A woman's chamber pot was often one of the first items she received upon marriage. Bridal dowries listed cleaning vessel of carved jade or porcelain pot with phoenix lid. Mothers might pass theirs down to daughters. Wealthier households had set some, shaped like lotuses, others painted with clouds, flowers, or bamboo leaves. One even bore a poem on its lid. Though not a vase, I hold what's given. Though not a bell, I sound relief. Take me gently, wash me well. I serve in silence, proud but brief. Chamber pots weren't hidden. In fact, they were part of daily etiquette. A proper young woman was expected to rise early, wash her face, and attend the pot before taking breakfast or starting embroidery. Handmaidens assisted elderly women, lifting the vessel to a screened-off corner of the chamber. A basin of warm water and soft cloth followed. The used pot was emptied discreetly by lower-ranking maids, who had set routines for washing, refilling, with ash, and airing it under the morning sun. But the toilet wasn't only functional, it was social in the hours before dawn. While the men still slept, women gathered near the back of the household. One poured tea, another aired bedding, and somewhere behind a partition, someone sat with a familiar clink of ceramic and whispered, "Did you hear what Mistress Liu said at the mid-autumn feast? Her pot was cracked. I told you. She never keeps secrets." And thus the chamber pot became a seat of soft power. Gossip flowed around it. Maids exchanged rumors. Older women reminisced. New brides cried softly into silk wipes. It was a moment away from judgment, from ritual, from the press of being virtuous. Within these few square feet of privacy, even the most proper lady might roll her eyes, smirk, or share an unguarded laugh. Men rarely entered this world. A husband might gift a new pot to a wife, but he would never touch it. And in his absence, the women ruled its domain. Some chamber pots even had nicknames. One noblewoman referred to hers as Little Cloud for its blue glaze. Another wrote in her diary, "My pot is loyal. It listens more than my mother-in-law." Whether these were jokes or laments, it's clear. Women attach personality and privacy to the object that served them most reliably. And when things went wrong, when a pot cracked, overflowed, or was dropped, there were rules. One never blamed the user. Maids apologized, washed the floor with rice water, sprinkled crushed chrysanthemum for scent, and replaced the pot quietly. If a pot broke during a guest visit, the host offered tea and laughter, a sign of fortune flushing away. Chamber pots also served ceremonial roles. During childbirth, the pot was placed near the birthing bed, not only for waste, but as a symbol of cleansing and transition. Some midwives insisted on burning a sprig of mugwort inside the empty pot afterward to ward off bad spirits. During funerals, women washed the chamber pots of the deceased and placed them beside the coffin, lid closed, so she may relieve her soul before the journey. And yet, for all this symbolism, the pot remained practical. Its cleaning, its carrying, its emptying, these were done with grace, but not grandeur. It was never praised in public. Yet if the chamber pot was forgotten for a day, the household noticed. Comfort faltered. Tempers shortened. Gossip dried up. So we ask, if this humble vessel held so much of a woman's world relief, rhythm, and rumor, why does it not appear in poems or scrolls? And what more could we learn from the silences of the pot? To the untrained eye, the chamber pot was a tool of necessity, used, washed, put away. But to the women of Han households, especially those behind the veils of the inner chambers, it held something more. Structure, status, and subtle kind of power. And those who handled it, often the lowliest handmaidens, knew exactly how much attention, discretion, and political instinct their work required. Let's meet one such servant. Ming, a maid in the house of a mid-ranking magistrate. Her job was not glamorous. Before sunrise, she crept barefoot through the women's quarters, carefully lifting chamber pots, still warm from use, and carrying them out the side passage to the washing courtyard. She never spoke unless spoken to. She never made noise. She never let the lid clatter. But Ming, like others in her position, knew everything. She knew which wives had stomach trouble, which daughters wept at night, which concubines had morning sickness long before the family acknowledged it. She saw the stains, the colors, the contents, and though she said nothing, she remembered. Because in the world of toilet management, silence was currency. The maids who emptied the pots were expected to be invisible, but were never unimportant. They were privy, in every sense, to the emotional undercurrents of the home, and some, especially those trusted by elder matriarchs, became confidants. A lady might lower her voice and ask softly, "Did she cry again last night?" Or, "Did you see if she used the pot today?" Answering, too, directly was risky, but a glance, a nod, or a gently phrased, "She seemed quiet this morning," said enough. Some maids gained influence this way. A well-placed remark could elevate them from pot duty to laundry, or even to assistant in the women's dressing room. Others fell from favor for the same reason: a mistimed comment, a sloshed pot, or a bit of gossip repeated too freely. And yet the pot remained in every corner of the women's quarters. It waited beneath curtains, beside cosmetic boxes and hairpins. Some were carefully positioned behind decorative screens. Others were left in the open, their presence understood. For pregnant women, a maid might warm the pot with a heated brick. For elderly matriarchs, it was brought hourly with whispered questions. "Shall I assist, madam?" These moments were intimate and repetitive, and through them, bonds formed. A daughter-in-law and her maid, a grandmother and her nurse, a pair of cousins sharing a laugh while one adjusted her robes and the other handed over a cloth, because chamber pots weren't only about relief. They were about timing, trust, and transition girls became women by managing their own pots, learning when to call for help and when to handle things in silence. Widows clung to their pot routines as one of the few remaining symbols of autonomy. And among concubines, chamber pot routines were political. The best pots were lacquered, lined with cloth, perfumed with dried tangerine peel. A lesser pot cracked, unpainted, was a social slight. This mattered, especially in large, competitive households. We have records of complaints. "Why does Lady Yuan get the silk-wrapped pot, and I the plain one?" Or, "Her maid refills her vinegar water, while mine forgets the ash." These weren't petty grievances. They were reflections of standing, and when tensions flared, the pot became a weapon, quiet, symbolic, but pointed. One story survives of a concubine who swapped another's pot with a chamber pot used for menstrual cloths. When discovered, the household erupted. The guilty maid was dismissed. The concubine was demoted. The pot was shattered and ritually buried, an act normally reserved for funerals. But most days, the chamber pot was simply present, a gentle echo in the background of domestic life. It held secrets, yes, but also structure. It created routines. And in a world where women had few public roles, the private routines of the pot became their own domain of expertise. And when a woman left her household, through marriage, death, or removal, her pot left with her. It was washed, wrapped in cloth, and either taken or broken. A sealed chamber pot, tied with red string, was sometimes buried in dowry trunks to ensure domestic harmony and healthy flows in the new home. So we ask, if every embroidered robe, every scroll of etiquette was preserved, why not the pots that serve quietly behind them? And if the chamber pot was a site of loyalty, laughter, and learning, shouldn't it deserve a place in our story of civilization? By the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty, political tremors shook the empire. Warlords clashed, capitals shifted, and fortunes rose and fell like the seasons. But in the inner quarters of homes across Luoyang, Changsha, and the far provinces, the chamber pot remained where it had always been. Beside the curtain, under the daybed, behind the folding screen, quiet, waiting. Its shape might have changed. Some grew wider, some taller, some fashioned with porcelain handles. But its role did not die. It was still the first thing a woman saw in the morning, and the last she used before extinguishing her lamp. It was still cleaned with care, never touched by men, and still guarded by the silence of generations. In some households, The pot was no longer just a personal item. It had become a family relic, passed down from mother to daughter-in-law, wrapped in cloth and presented alongside jewelry or robes. It was offered not as a joke, but as a gesture of deep domestic wisdom. "Take care of this," one widow is recorded to have said, "and your house will never fall into disorder." Why? Because the pot represented stability. It embodied routine, cleanliness, self-respect. To manage it properly meant to manage the rhythms of the household. This understanding was formalized in certain etiquette texts. A 2nd century domestic manual, the Scroll of Inner Harmony, advises, "The lady of the hall must be first to rise, last to sleep, and daily tend to 3 things: her robe, her meal, and her chamber pot. Let none be stained, let none be cracked, for these are the mirrors of her household heart." In such texts, we begin to glimpse the chamber pot as more than functional. It becomes symbolic dot for new brides. The pot was a test. If she managed it, well, quietly, cleanly, without complaints, she earned favor. If she misused it or neglected it, elders noticed. For elder matriarchs, the pot became their throne. Many were too frail to use outdoor privies. The presence of a dedicated pot near their bed was a marker of status and familial respect. Some even commissioned artisans to inscribe poetry onto the lacquered lid. One fragment recovered from a tomb reads, "Where strength is left, still grace remains. I sit in quiet and am not ashamed." For maids, the pot's cleaning remained a rite of loyalty. Many served a single woman their entire lives. When their mistress died, it was the maid who washed the final chamber pot, sealed it, and either broke it as a rite or buried it beside her. Some chamber pots, particularly ornate ones, were included in tombs. A few have been recovered in pristine condition, lids sealed, contents long vanished. They were likely empty when placed. Symbolic vessels meant to provide comfort and continuity in the afterlife. In one notable tomb near modern-day Zhengzhou, a noblewoman's burial included a chamber pot carved with lotus petals, a small jar of dried Asha bamboo scraper wrapped in silke folded cloth perfumed with lavender root together. These items formed a sanitation set not unlike those found in male tombs for armor or wine. To her, this was not embarrassment. It was a mark of order, grace, and readiness. A message: I live clean, I die clean. So much of women's history has been erased, reduced to shadows behind palace screens. But the chamber pot remains. In poems, in scrolls, in soil god, it speaks not of scandal or spectacle, but of something deeper: the quiet governance of the private world. The wisdom passed in whispers, the routine sustained through centuries. And so we ask, in a history that praises public glory, who will honor private grace? Because the pot that served in silence deserves a place beside the brush, the sword, and the scroll. To most people, a flooded toilet is an inconvenience. In Han China, it could be a warning from heaven. Long before rain gauges and weather scrolls, Han farmers watched the sky, but they also watched their toilets, specifically their latrines and compost pits. These quiet corners, dug behind barns or beside bamboo fences, served as crude but effective early flood indicators. And in a land crisscrossed by rivers prone to both drought and deluge, that made the toilet not just useful, but prophetic. Let's begin in a village south of the Yellow River. Around 70 BCE, a farmer rises early, wraps his robe, and walks to his latrine trench. It's ringed with stones and partially covered by a wooden seat. Normally, it drains slowly through packed earth and ash into a nearby compost pit. But this morning, the pit is already wet. Not from overuse, but from groundwater swelling up from below. He knows what this means. Within days, the low fields may flood. He tightens the trench's bamboo fence, moves his compost buckets to higher ground, tells the neighbors. Someone informs the district office. and by midday, 2 scribes arrived to inspect. This isn't myth. Surviving records from provincial granary towns mention privy overflow warnings, see Chow Z, as part of rural alert systems. When drains failed and pits refused to absorb waste, it wasn't always due to blockage. It often meant the ground was saturated, and heavy rain had swollen the water table. Toilets, in this context, were like muddy barometers. And people paid attention. In Han farming manuals like the Kimin Yao Shu. Sections on sanitation sit alongside notes on flood behavior. One entry reads, "When the pit drains slowly and the earth around bubbles with no rain, dig ditches, tell neighbors, move grain." Even in cities like Luoyang, street latrines served a similar role. Asterisk public trench toilets, built with open tops and stone-lined drains, were known to back up during periods of rising canal water. Guards assigned to these latrines were trained not only to clean, but to report sudden overflows. One record from a district sanitation report notes, "The southern trench has spilled thrice this moon, though rain was mild." The clerk advised, "The canal gate be raised." These trench floods weren't just messy. They were signals, hidden alerts in the most unglamorous corners of the city, that nature was shifting beneath the feet of Civilization. Some administrators took this seriously. In the reign of Emperor Zhuan, 7449 BCE, officials in charge of canal maintenance reportedly used latrine reports alongside rain tallies and moonphase charts to predict agricultural risk. A surviving bamboo slip from a granary record notes, "Privy trench near Gate 3 overflowed without cause. Ground soft. Canal level stable. Predict flood by next market day." They were right. That flood destroyed 2 rice paddies. In households, toilet placement became part of flood planning. Farmers dug their pits higher in the yard. Ash jars were kept near the door, not only to deodorize, but to absorb water when the trench backed up. Some households even constructed emergency overflow channels, shallow grooves lined with bricks or broken pottery, directing waste runoff away from the home and toward empty fields. Toilets also became part of oral flood lore. Elders told children, "If the pit smells sweet, rain will be brief. If it smells sour, the river stirs." Another saying went, "Dry seat, dry sky. Wet seat, wet thigh." Crude, but accurate. Toilets told the truth before the clouds did. So, in a way, sanitation wasn't just civil, it was seasonal. And the wise farmer or watchful servant who noted a rising pit might save grain, rescue livestock, or simply sleep, better knowing they had time to act. Which leads us to wonder, if the Han could see the river's moods in the toilet trench, what other secrets of survival were buried there? By the mid-Han period, flood prediction had become a quiet science. Not a science of scrolls and proclamations, but of trenches and trenches alone. Rural life depended on subtle signs, cloud thickness, frog songs, the direction of wind. But none were quite so tangible as the toilet pit. Let's break it down. Standard household latrine in the Han countryside was a dry pit dug into firm earth, about 2 to 3 chi deep, roughly a meter, lined with straw or broken tile, sometimes ringed, with bricks if the family had the means. Above it, a wooden or stone platform. Beside it, a jar of ash, a scraper, and maybe a small basin of water for rinsing. But when flood season approached, particularly during spring melts or heavy summer rains, the pit's behavior changed. Waste didn't settle. Ash stayed afloat. The soil around the pit grew spongy, and occasionally, the pit gurgled as groundwater pushed upward. This was not just noticed. It was studied in agricultural districts. Pit depth was correlated with soil type. Scribes noted that in sandy soils, Rising water seeped in from below more rapidly, while in clay-rich areas, water pooled above the surface first. Over time, these observations formed provincial sanitation maps, early records of where latrines backed up first, and how fast floods moved across lowland zones. One fragment recovered from a bamboo archive in Shu province details pit behavior by elevation. In high fields, first overflow comes after 5 full rains. In valley farms, the pit rises after 3. If worms emerge on the seat slab, flood follows within 2 days. Worms on the seat might sound odd, but it was a genuine sign. Earthworms fleeing the saturated ground, wriggling up through the latrine slab's edges, seeking air.han officials assigned to inland waterways, those managing canals, dams, and ferry routes, were instructed to check the condition of latrines in rest stops along the way. Records from a canal guard station near the Sea River read, "Trenches full at 3 inns. Pits hold smell of wet grain. Recommend warning upstream." Rice districts. It wasn't poetic. It was a literal smell test, and the guards were often correct. Within days of such reports, canals surged. Ferries halted. Farmers scrambled to move grain stores higher. Privies, in this context, were not just toilets. They were warning bells, rung by the very land beneath them. In urban Luoyang, latrine guards contributed to this system as well. Each month, sanitation supervisors collected data not just on waste volume, but moisture levels. A particularly well-preserved ledger from the Western Market District lists terms like pit swollen soil slick bucket lightened by seepage jar clumped without use. From these cryptic lines, we glimpse a city's rhythm with its groundwater. When pits gurgled and claws dampened without contact, it wasn't ignored. It was escalated. At the macro level, Han astronomers and natural philosophers tried to pair these patterns with lunar charts and ancestral omens. But the practical truth came from farmers, guards, and women tending compost pits. They saw the signs first literally rising beneath them. Some rural villages even assigned flood watchers, whose job was to monitor toilet behavior during monsoon seasons. These weren't just janitors. They were unofficial meteorologists. One carved sign, posted outside a granary privy during flood season, reads, "Pit slow to drain. River due to rise. Stack grain on upper shelf." Simple. Functional. Effective. By the 1st century CE, certain households even designed double-tiered latrine pits built higher above ground with a catch basin beneath, allowing for normal use, even during minor flooding. These were rare, expensive, but admired. A tax clerk visiting such a household reportedly remarked, "Even heaven's water can't embarrass this man's seat." But innovation aside, most flood alerts still began with one thing: the pit filling too fast, or too strangely, or too early in the season. And so, the question follows: if the toilets were this accurate and gauging nature, did anyone ever record these flood pit patterns formally? And why, after the fall of Han, were these small flood sciences flushed from the record? In the final century of the Han Dynasty, as central power began to wane and the empire trembled under warlord rule, one might assume the quiet science of latrine watching faded away. But strangely, it didn't. If anything, the overflowing toilet became more important than ever, especially in a fractured empire where local knowledge meant survival. Let's revisit a village in the southern basin near modern-day Hubei. Spring. Rains arrive early. The old men mutter about how the ash won't settle and the scraper comes up damp. A pit, usually dry in spring, begins to smell before the first true storm. Within a week, the footpath to the river becomes soft. Another few days, and the stream floods its banks. There are no imperial inspectors now, no court astronomers, just villagers, counting on the knowledge passed down not from books, but from toilets thought the elder sends a boy on foot to the grain depot. The pit has risen too soon, he says. Tell the clerk. And the clerk listens, because even without state machinery, the logic still holds. Waste doesn't lie. A latrine fills too early or too fast, and the earth is telling you something. Some of these village-level alert systems became semi-official. In regions where record-keeping survived, we find slips and fragments noting pit filled too fast in low south quarter. Suggest raise of dike. Seepage from privy trench before fifth moon early for summer rains. Compost too wet to turn. No rain. Ground sick. In one fascinating example from later Han archives, a canal supervisor named Pei Liang wrote, directly to his superior, using the euphemism, "The earth drinks not what the belly gives. Send timber for the banks." A poetic way of saying, the privies aren't draining, flood is coming. And yet, even as these insights persisted in practice, they began to disappear from prestige. The fall of the Han Dynasty ushered in chaos and competing dynasties. New rulers sought legitimacy through cosmic signs, imperial rituals, and rewritten history. The humble latrine, so critical to flood survival, was no longer considered worthy of inclusion in scholarly chronicles. What had been practical knowledge was now invisible wisdom preserved in village sayings, passed in field instructions, whispered by elders beside newly dug pits. Not lost, but buried. Archaeologists today, poring over pit layers and silted trenches, are beginning to reconstruct this forgotten science. From the sediment depths of public latrines, they can tell when flooding occurred, sometimes even before. Historical records note it. In one such case, a latrine layer in Chang'an shows sudden influxes of silty water mixed with compost. Dating to the very week, a flood was said to have overwhelmed the canal district. No court scroll mentioned the toilets, but they told the truth anyway. And now, 2,000 years later, we listen. Modern hydrologists studying ancient flood patterns along the Yellow River have begun consulting latrine data, both archaeological and literary, to understand early warning signs. The alignment between pit overflow patterns and actual flood seasons is remarkable. It turns out the Han were right. When the waste won't settle, the waters won't either. So we end this story not with a disaster, but with a quiet idea that survival came not from heroes or edicts, but from watching the Earth's subtle shifts, from knowing that when the lowest places begin to fill, it's time to prepare. And so we ask, in a world increasingly reliant on digital forecasts, satellites, and models, who still watches the humble? Signs? Who still listens when the latrine begins to whisper? Story 11. The Emperor's Night Soil. Royal waste management in Han palaces, in the golden stillness of a Han palace chamber. Beneath painted rafters and embroidered curtains, a delicate ritual unfolds. A boy eunuch, barely 14, kneels beside a carved cedar box. Inside it rests a lacquered chamber pot black with red trim, its lid etched with the seal of the heavenly sun. This is the Emperor's night soil bucket. And no, this isn't metaphor. It's exactly what it sounds like, the vessel used to collect. The Emperor's waste. It may seem undignified, but in Han China, the imperial body was considered sacred, a conduit between heaven and earth. And if his voice was a law, and his sleep an omen, then his digestion was a sign of cosmic balance. His waste was not filth. It was a message, and someone had to carry it. The task fell to a specific class of palace eunuchs, trained not only in silence and obedience, but in ritual sanitation. These attendants belonged to the Neishi Bureau, the Office of Inner Affairs, and were responsible for managing the emperor's most intimate routines. Chief among them, the care, collection, and disposal of royal waste. The daily routine began before dawn. A eunuch entered the emperor's sleeping quarters barefoot, his robe bound at the sleeves and his head lowered. He lifted the pot by its inlaid jade handles without peeking inside. The lid, if moist with condensation, was wiped with perfumed cloth. The contents were never described aloud. Instead, a silent code of symbols was carved into a small wooden slip. 1 circle equals smooth. 2 lines equals dry. A swirl equals unformed. Dot equals blood present. These slips were sent directly to the court physicians. Yes, the emperor's stool was medically assessed. Every single day, doctors would read the slip, inspect the pot if necessary, often behind a screen, and recommend adjustments to diet or herbal tonics. Some even claimed to sense imbalanced qi from the smell alone. This was not just routine. It was governance. When the emperor's bowels ran smoothly, the court breathed easy. When he was constipated, ministers delayed sensitive discussions. If diarrhea persisted, sacrifices were ordered. A sick emperor's digestive irregularities were seen as signs of heaven's disapproval. Thus, the toilet became a tool of statecraft, but managing the emperor's waste went beyond the medical. It was ceremonial. The chamber pot itself was custom-made crafted by palace artisans from polished hardwood, lacquered 6 times, and occasionally inlaid with jade or gold dust. Its base bore the characters for heavenly purity. It sat within a cedar box lined with wax cloth and scented rice paper. The eunuch tasked with carrying it wore gloves of silk or hemp, depending on the season. Disposal was its own ritual. The pot was never emptied within palace grounds. Instead, it was carried, beneath a discreet linen shroud, through the back halls and into a sealed corridor leading to the waste pavilion, a private facility deep within the rear gardens. There, a second eunuch received it, bowed, and poured the contents into a dedicated night soil jar, one reserved for imperial waste only. This jar was sealed, marked with the day's glyph, and stored in a composting cellar under constant supervision. Why such care? Because waste theft was a genuine fear. Rumors circulated of sorcerers or spies seeking access to the emperor's waste for purposes ranging from black magic to political blackmail. One old court record warns, "Let no hand touch what heaven has discarded. To steal the night soil of the Son of Heaven is death." Guards were posted along the compost cellar entrance. Eunuchs sworn to secrecy were punished for speaking of the pot's contents. And each disposal was logged in the palace sanitation register, an actual bureaucratic record, not unlike tax scrolls. Even the emperor himself was aware. He occasionally joked with favored consorts or ministers about the heavenly bucket. One diary fragment from a concubine reads, "His Majesty said today that his pot is wiser than the chancellor. It never leaks and speaks only truth." Still, for the eunuchs, it was serious. One was recorded as saying on his deathbed, "I serve beneath the robes of heaven. My hands carried what others dared not smell." He was buried with his tools gloves, a scrap of scented cloth, and a jade-handled ladle dot. So we ask, if the emperor's waste was so closely monitored, so ritualized, so feared, what does it reveal about how power understood the body? And when the pot was empty, and the slip delivered, and the corridor swept, what did the empire dream beneath its perfumed lid? The deeper you go into the Han Palace, the quieter it becomes. Behind the screens of silk and the halls of sandalwood, beyond the perfumed gardens and polished jade tiles, lies one of the most meticulously managed systems in the imperial world. The toilet chain of command. And at the top of this strange pyramid stood the Son of Heaven. At the bottom, an entire bureaucratic apparatus built to manage his bodily waste. Let's trace the structure. At its foundation were the junior eunuchs boys trained in obedience, modesty, and sanitation. Their duties were specific: clean the pot, carry the pot, wash the claws, refill the vinegar jars, burn the wormwood incense, and report any irregularity in tone, odor, or Volume. They never made eye contact. They never spoke unless addressed. Their work was precise. Almost invisible dot above them stood the privy steward's mid-level eunuchs who coordinated the entire sanitation schedule. They determined who carried what, when to dispose of what, and whether a day's stool warranted physician review or not. These stewards kept logs, not just of waste consistency, but of time, location, and celestial phase. Yes, celestial phase. In hand belief, heavens. Rhythms shaped the emperor's health. If waste arrived too early on a yin day, or too late under a fire star, the physicians might suggest ritual fasting. Privy stewards worked closely with court astrologers to align elimination with cosmology. And above them all was a single, high-ranking official, the master of inner hygiene. Rarely mentioned in court scrolls, this official answered only to the emperor's chamberlain and had direct access to the imperial physician. His role was part spiritual, part political, to ensure the emperor's bowels moved in harmony with both heaven and earth. He coordinated composting rotations, inspected the cedar waste vaults, and oversaw the ritual burning of old chamber pot lids. He was also the final reviewer of sanitary intelligence. Yes, that's what it was called in the palace. Intelligence gathered from the emperor's daily waste. Let's pause there. In modern terms, this might sound absurd, but in the Han Palace, the body was law, and the body's processes were signals. A change in stool shape could reflect changes in appetite, sleep, mood could shift decisions shaped governance. In this way, the emperor's waste became political weather, and those who monitored it held influence far beyond their humble titles. Some officials used this access wisely. Others did not. There's record of a sanitation steward named Zun Yi, who falsified daily slips to suggest that the emperor was sleeping well and eating heavily, when in truth, the son of heaven was constipated, anxious, and skipping meals. When the emperor discovered the deception after a misdiagnosis led to a public fainting episode, Zun Yi was dismissed and quietly exiled. It was a lesson. Truth begins in the trench. Meanwhile, at court, ministers gossiped quietly about which physician had inspected the pot that morning. A subtle shift in palace policy. Blamed yesterday's digestion. A generous decree? Someone might say, His Majesty must have passed smoothly. Court poets, forbidden to speak directly of the chamber pot, used euphemism. One famously wrote, "When the cedar lid lifts, may heaven be pleased. May vinegar calm the steam of worry, and may what exits bear no omen but ease." It was a joke, but also a prayer. Even consorts understood the power of waste. A favored lady might recommend a new herbal wine or fruit for the emperor's digestion. If it worked, her standing rose. If it failed, she might lose her seat beside him. One such woman, Lady Fei, gifted a concoction of lotus seeds and honey to ease the heavenly blockage. It worked so well the emperor had her name inscribed, not on a scroll, but on the underside of his chamber pot lid. But waste could also reveal scandal. There is one known case of imperial poisoning, discovered only because the privy log showed unusual color and bitterness in the early morning stool. A physician risked execution by reporting the anomaly only to be rewarded when the emperor survived and traced the attempt to a jealous cousin. The toilet had spoken and saved the throne. In time, even other nobles began to emulate this system. High-ranking ministers in Luoyang began keeping privy logs, hiring waste reviewers and burning incense near their compost bins. It became a mark of elegance, civilized disposal, they called it. And yet, for all its complexity, the system depended on silence. The eunuchs, stewards, and hygiene masters who kept it running did so with no glory. Their work left no monument. Their logs were burned each season, but the palace ran smoothly, in part, because they did. Which brings us to wonder if the emperor's Decisions pass through the gut before reaching the scroll. Should we not see the toilet as the first page of statecraft? And if those closest to the pot knew the truth before anyone else, who really ruled the realm? As the Han Dynasty's golden age waned, so too did the elaborate network of palace sanitation slowly shift beneath the weight of history. But while dynasties rose and fell, the ritual of royal waste management left an indelible imprint on governance and culture. The eunuchs who carried the emperor's chamber pots, the stewards who logged his bowels, the masters who oversaw compost and disposal all, vanished into the shadows of time, unnamed and unthanked. Yet their influence endured. For centuries, imperial courts and subsequent dynasties copied and adapted the sanitation bureaucracy established in Han times. Records from the Tang and Song dynasties mention palace latrine directors and waste ministers overseeing everything from pot design to ritual disposal. The meticulous attention to royal digestion was institutionalized, a legacy born in Han halls. More broadly, the concept that bodily health and state health were intertwined persisted in Chinese political philosophy. Confucian scholars wrote that a ruler who cared for his body through proper diet, rest, and yes, regular and dignified elimination was better prepared to govern wisely. This ethos shaped court medicine and politics alike. An emperor's personal health was public business. To neglect digestion was to invite disorder. To monitor waste was to monitor fate. And so, the humble chamber pot of the Son of Heaven symbolized something profound, that even the greatest power is founded on the simplest acts. It reminds us today that leadership is often about attending to the mundane, the small routines, the daily care, the unseen systems that keep a society functioning. The palace sanitation network may not have made the history books, but it helped write history itself. As we step away from the quiet corridors and sealed chambers, we carry with us a final reflection. Power, like waste, must be managed thoughtfully, with respect, care, and unflinching attention. Because whether emperor or commoner, throne or toilet, it is the unseen systems that sustain us all.